Grizzly bear attacks, highway rest stop, 3 killed in bathrooms, May 7th, 2025. The Montana Department of Transportation had installed the bronze plaque commemorating the Interstate 90 Pipestone Rest Area in 1987, proudly declaring it a gateway to the Treasure State's wilderness heritage. 38 years later, on the morning of May 7th, 2025, that same wilderness would reclaim its territory in the most violent way imaginable, transforming a routine highway stop into a scene of unprecedented carnage that would forever alter the lives of dozens of travelers and reshape wildlife management policies across the American West. Dr. Laura Chen pressed her foot harder against the accelerator of her silver Toyota Camry as the digital clock on her dashboard clicked over to 8:47 a.m. The 38-mile stretch between Butte and Bozeman had become increasingly familiar over the past 6 months since she'd begun her rotation at the trauma center in Bozeman. At 42, Laura had spent the better part of 2 decades as an emergency room physician in Seattle, but a contentious divorce and the desire for a fresh start had brought her to Montana's wide-open spaces. Her ex-husband Marcus had fought her relocation bitterly, arguing that their 12-year-old daughter Emma needed stability, but the family court had ultimately approved the move with the stipulation that Emma would spend summers and alternating holidays with her father. The irony wasn't lost on Laura, that she was now commuting through some of the most dangerous wildlife territory in the lower 48 states to work in a trauma center that regularly treated victims of bear encounters, mountain lion attacks, and wilderness accidents. She'd already seen 3 bear mauling victims in her short tenure, each case reinforcing the deadly serious nature of human-wildlife conflict in this region. The Pipestone Rest Area represented the exact midpoint of her daily commute, and she'd stopped there dozens of times over the past months, usually just to stretch her legs and grab a coffee from the vending machines housed in the small visitor center adjacent to the restroom facilities. Laura's medical bag sat in the passenger seat beside her, a habit she'd maintained since her residency days at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. The bag contained standard emergency supplies, hemostatic agents, pressure bandages, airways, medications for anaphylaxis and cardiac events, and a trauma kit that had saved 3 lives during her career. She had no way of knowing that within the next 2 hours, that same medical bag would prove both invaluable and heartbreakingly insufficient for the catastrophe that was already in motion in the dense lodgepole pine forest surrounding the rest area. 23 miles behind Laura's Camry, Samuel Ross was fighting to keep his eyes open behind the wheel of his diesel-powered Ford F-350. At 57, Samuel had been driving long-haul routes for Yellowstone Freight Lines for over 3 decades, and this particular run from Billings to Seattle was one he'd completed more than 200 times. His logbook showed he'd been driving for 9 hours with a mandatory break still 3 hours away, but his experience had taught him to recognize the signs of driver fatigue before they became dangerous. The Pipestone Rest Area was a scheduled stop on his route, officially designated for a 30-minute safety break to inspect his load and update his electronic logs. Samuel's cargo manifest listed 42,000 pounds of agricultural equipment bound for farming operations in Washington State's Columbia River Valley. The load was properly secured and balanced, well within the 80,000-pound gross vehicle weight limit. But the early morning temperature differential between the warm cab and the cold Montana air had created condensation issues that required monitoring. More importantly, Samuel was beginning to experience the micro-sleep episodes that had ended too many trucking careers and claimed too many lives on America's highways. His wife, Margaret, had packed him a thermos of coffee and her famous roast beef sandwiches before his 11 p.m. departure from Billings the previous evening. They'd been married for 31 years, and she understood the rhythms and demands of over-the-road trucking better than most. Their two children, now adults with families of their own, had grown up with a father who was gone for weeks at a time, but who provided a stable middle-class life through his dedication to the profession. Samuel had planned to retire in 18 months when he reached his full Social Security benefit age, and he and Margaret had already purchased a small ranch outside of Bozeman where they intended to raise cattle and enjoy their golden years. The CB radio in Samuel's truck crackled intermittently with traffic reports and driver chatter, but the early morning airways were relatively quiet. He'd spoken briefly with another Yellowstone freight driver heading eastbound near Missoula, confirming road conditions and sharing information about a multi-vehicle accident that had closed one lane near Garrison for 3 hours during the night. Samuel's experience had taught him that information was safety on the highways, and he maintained relationships with dozens of drivers who shared intelligence about weather, road conditions, law enforcement activity, and potential hazards. Samuel had no awareness that 12 miles ahead of his position, a 430-pound male grizzly bear, designated as Bear 441 by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had spent the previous 18 hours investigating the unusual concentration of human scents around the Pipestone Rest area. The bear had been tagged and fitted with a GPS collar as part of a long-term research study tracking grizzly movement patterns and human-wildlife interaction incidents. For the past 6 days, Bear 441 had been following the Pipestone Creek drainage system, feeding on early spring vegetation and investigating winter-killed ungulates that had washed down from higher elevations during the spring snowmelt. The bear's collar data, which would later prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events, showed that he had first approached the rest area perimeter at 3:17 a.m., spending approximately 2 hours investigating dumpsters, picnic tables, and the exterior of the visitor center building. Grizzly bears possess olfactory capabilities approximately 7 times more sensitive than bloodhounds, and Bear 441 had detected the accumulated scent signatures of thousands of travelers who had used the facility over the previous weeks. Food odors from improperly disposed lunch remnants, personal care products, and the general human activity around the rest area had created what wildlife biologists call an attractant sink, a concentration of appealing scents that draw bears into increasingly close contact with human infrastructure. Daniel Yates was oblivious to the presence of Bear 441 as he guided his red Honda Civic into the rest area parking lot at 9:15 a.m. At 33, Daniel was returning to his hometown of Spokane after spending 8 months working as a ski instructor at Big Sky Resort. The seasonal employment had been both physically demanding and financially rewarding, allowing him to pay down student loans from his marketing degree while spending the winter months pursuing his passion for alpine skiing. His Honda was packed with ski equipment, winter clothing, and the accumulated possessions of nearly a year of Montana living. Daniel had grown up in the suburbs of Spokane, and his understanding of wilderness hazards was largely theoretical, gleaned from nature documentaries and the occasional camping trip to managed campgrounds in national forests. His parents, Robert and Susan Yates, had raised him and his younger sister in a comfortable middle-class environment where the greatest wildlife threat was the occasional raccoon raiding garbage cans. His decision to spend a year in Montana had represented a significant departure from his usual risk-averse lifestyle, and his family had supported the adventure while privately worrying about everything from avalanches to wildlife encounters. The job at Big Sky had exceeded Daniel's expectations in every way. He'd become an accomplished, advanced intermediate skier, developed confidence in backcountry environments, and formed friendships with other seasonal workers from across the country. His supervisor, Elena Rodriguez, had already offered him a position for the following winter season, and Daniel was seriously considering making the arrangement permanent. His parents had visited twice during the winter, and even his traditionally cautious father had been impressed by Daniel's obvious happiness and newfound competence in mountain environments. Daniel's plan for the day was straightforward: drive the familiar 400-mile route from Big Sky to Spokane, making periodic stops to rest and stretch, and arrive home in time for dinner with his parents. He'd made the same drive in reverse 8 months earlier when he'd first relocated to Montana, and the Pipestone Rest Area had been his preferred stopping point due to its clean facilities and the impressive mountain views visible from the picnic area. His Honda Civic had performed admirably throughout the Montana winter, equipped with all-season tires that had proven adequate for most conditions, though he'd invested in a set of tire chains that had remained unused in his trunk. The morning of May 7th had dawned clear and cold, with overnight temperatures dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and daytime highs forecast to reach only 45 degrees. A high-pressure system had settled over the region, bringing crystalline visibility and light winds that created perfect conditions for long-distance driving. Daniel had departed Big Sky at 7:30 a.m. after loading his car and completing a final walkthrough of his employee housing unit. The drive through the Gallatin National Forest had been spectacular, with fresh snow visible on the higher peaks and abundant wildlife activity along the roadway. Daniel had already observed 2 separate groups of elk feeding in meadows visible from the highway, and he'd been tempted to stop for photographs on several occasions. His digital camera contained nearly 800 photos from his Montana year, documenting everything from powder skiing adventures to wildlife encounters, and he'd planned to create a comprehensive photo album as a gift for his parents. The camera sat on the passenger seat beside him, easily accessible for any additional photo opportunities that might present themselves during the remainder of his journey. At 9:18 a.m., Bear 441's GPS collar recorded his position as being approximately 40 yards northeast of the rest area's main parking lot, concealed within a dense thicket of serviceberry bushes and lodgepole pines that provided excellent cover while maintaining visual and olfactory contact with human activity. The bear's behavior patterns over the previous 72 hours indicated a significant increase in daytime activity and a corresponding decrease in the wariness of human presence that typically characterizes healthy grizzly bears in occupied habitat. Wildlife behaviorists would later identify this pattern as indicative of a bear that had become habituated to human presence while simultaneously losing its natural fear response. Bear 441's history included 6 previous human-wildlife conflict incidents dating back to his initial capture and tagging as a 3-year-old male in 2019. 4 of these incidents had involved property damage at remote cabins and hunting camps, while 2 had resulted in close encounters with hikers and hunters that had been resolved without injury through the use of bear spray and noise deterrents. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had classified Bear 441 as a management concern, but had not yet designated him for relocation or removal due to the relatively minor nature of his previous infractions and his consistent pattern of avoiding direct confrontation with humans. The decision to allow Bear 441 to remain in his established territory would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and litigation, particularly when it was revealed that his GPS collar data showed he had spent significant time in the immediate vicinity of the Pipestone Rest Area on 12 separate occasions over the previous 14 months. Wildlife management protocols required escalated intervention when bears demonstrated persistent attraction to human infrastructure. But bureaucratic delays and budget constraints had prevented the implementation of appropriate management actions. Dr. Laura Chen's silver Camry entered the rest area parking lot at 9:22 a.m., just 7 minutes after Daniel Yates had arrived. Laura parked approximately 30 feet from Daniel's Honda, choosing a space that provided easy access back onto the interstate while positioning her vehicle in the shade of a large ponderosa pine. The morning sun was climbing steadily in the eastern sky, and Laura knew from experience that the interior of her car would become uncomfortably warm within minutes if left in direct sunlight. Laura's intention was to make a quick stop for coffee and to use the restroom before continuing her commute to Bozeman. She'd consumed a large cup of coffee at home and had drunk a 16-ounce bottle of water during the drive, creating the physiological need for a restroom break. Her medical training had taught her the importance of staying properly hydrated, particularly during the transition from Seattle's humid climate to Montana's dry air, but it also meant more frequent stops during long drives. As Laura gathered her purse and locked her car, she observed Daniel Yates stretching beside his Honda Civic and performing what appeared to be a routine inspection of his tires and vehicle exterior. The sight reminded her of her ex-husband Marcus, who had possessed the same methodical approach to travel preparation and vehicle maintenance. The comparison triggered a brief moment of melancholy as she thought about Emma, who would be finishing her school day in Seattle while Laura was beginning her shift at the trauma center. Laura's phone contained 3 text messages from Emma that had arrived during the drive, each one a brief update about her day and expressions of affection that helped bridge the geographical distance between mother and daughter. Emma had adapted to the separation better than Laura had expected, though she knew from her conversations with Marcus that their daughter experienced periodic sadness about the family's dissolution. Laura had scheduled a long weekend visit to Seattle for the following month, and Emma was planning her first extended stay in Montana for the summer months. The rest area's visitor center contained 4 vending machines, 2 picnic tables, and an information display featuring maps of local hiking trails and wildlife viewing opportunities. A bulletin board displayed current conditions reports for nearby wilderness areas, warnings about seasonal wildlife activity, and regulations regarding food storage and waste disposal in bear country. Laura had read these displays dozens of times during previous stops, and she'd developed a healthy respect for the potential dangers of Montana's wilderness environments. The most recent posting on the bulletin board was dated May 2nd, 5 days earlier, and detailed increased grizzly bear activity throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as bears emerged from winter hibernation. The posting specifically warned travelers to properly dispose of food waste, to never leave food items in vehicles, and to report any wildlife encounters to local authorities. The information was accurate and well-intentioned, but it failed to convey the immediate and specific threat posed by Bear 441's presence in the immediate vicinity of the rest area. Samuel Ross's Ford F-350 entered the rest area at 9:31 a.m., the diesel engine's distinctive rumble announcing his arrival to anyone within a quarter-mile radius. Samuel executed a wide turning radius to accommodate his 53-foot trailer, positioning the rig in the designated truck parking area on the eastern edge of the facility. The process of safely parking a combination vehicle of this size required skill and experience, particularly in a confined space with multiple potential obstacles, including other parked vehicles, light poles, and landscaping features. Samuel's mandatory inspection routine began immediately upon setting the parking brake and engaging the air brake system. Federal regulations required commercial drivers to inspect their vehicles and loads at regular intervals, documenting any defects or maintenance issues that could affect safe operation. Samuel's inspection checklist included tire pressure and tread depth, brake system function, lighting systems, coupling mechanisms, and load securement devices. The morning air temperature of 31 degrees Fahrenheit created visible exhaust vapor as Samuel conducted his walk-around inspection, breathing steadily as he examined each component of his vehicle and trailer combination. His inspection revealed no defects or maintenance issues, and his load of agricultural equipment remained properly secured within the trailer. Samuel's experience had taught him that thorough inspections prevented roadside breakdowns and potential accidents, and he took professional pride in maintaining his equipment in optimal condition. Samuel's logbook indicated that he was approaching the federal limit for driving time without a mandatory rest period, and he planned to use the stop at Pipestone to update his electronic logs and consume the coffee and sandwich that Margaret had prepared for him. The thermos contained enough coffee for 2 large cups, and the roast beef sandwiches represented a substantial meal that would sustain him through the remainder of his drive to Seattle. During his walk-around inspection, Samuel noticed Daniel Yates photographing the mountain scenery with what appeared to be a high-quality digital camera. The sight reminded Samuel of his own son David, who had developed a passion for landscape photography during his college years and now operated a successful wedding photography business in Denver. Samuel and Margaret had supported David's artistic pursuits even when they seemed financially impractical, and their patience had been rewarded when David's business had flourished and provided him with both creative satisfaction and financial security. Samuel also observed Dr. Laura Chen entering the visitor center, noting her professional attire and the confident manner in which she moved through the environment. Samuel's experience with thousands of travelers had given him an intuitive ability to assess people quickly, and something about Laura suggested medical or other professional training. He would later remember this observation with devastating clarity when he found himself depending on Laura's medical expertise during the crisis that was about to unfold. Bear 441's GPS collar recorded a significant change in position at 9:33 a.m., indicating movement from his concealed observation post toward the rest area's infrastructure. Subsequent analysis of the collar data would reveal that the bear had moved approximately 25 yards closer to the parking area, positioning himself within the tree line that bordered the facility's northwestern boundary. This location provided the bear with excellent concealment while offering multiple approach routes to the visitor center, restroom facilities, and parked vehicles. The bear's motivation for this movement toward human activity represents one of the most complex and controversial aspects of the subsequent investigation. Wildlife behaviorists would later argue about whether Bear 441's actions represented normal exploratory behavior, aggressive territorial response, predatory assessment, or the aberrant decision-making process of a bear whose natural instincts had been compromised by habituation to human presence. Bear 441's physical condition at the time of the incident was later determined to be excellent, with the bear showing no signs of injury, disease, or nutritional stress that might have influenced his behavior. Post-incident examination would reveal that the bear was in his physical prime, possessing the muscle mass, bone density, and fat reserves consistent with a healthy adult male grizzly in optimal condition. His teeth showed normal wear patterns, his coat was thick and healthy, and his body weight of 430 pounds placed him in the 95th percentile for adult male grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone population. The bear's approach toward the rest area occurred during a period of relatively high human activity, with 3 vehicles in the parking area and multiple people visible in the vicinity of the visitor center and restroom facilities. Normal grizzly behavior in such circumstances would involve withdrawal to avoid human contact, particularly for a bear with Bear 441's history of successfully avoiding confrontations. The decision to approach rather than retreat represented a fundamental change in the bear's risk assessment behavior that would have catastrophic consequences. Dr. Laura Chen emerged from the visitor center at 9:36 a.m., carrying a cup of coffee and a package of trail mix purchased from the vending machines. Her intention was to consume her snack while enjoying the mountain views from one of the picnic tables before continuing her commute to Bozeman. The trail mix contained almonds, dried cranberries, and chocolate pieces, all of which would later be identified as potential attractants that may have influenced Bear 441's behavior. Laura selected a picnic table positioned approximately 40 feet from the visitor center, with unobstructed views of the Cabinet Mountains to the west and the Tobacco Root Mountains to the south. The morning sun had warmed the wooden table surface, making it comfortable for sitting despite the cool air temperature. Laura's medical training had instilled in her an appreciation for brief periods of stress reduction and mindfulness, and she developed a habit of taking a few minutes to center herself mentally before beginning her hospital shifts. As Laura settled at the picnic table, she observed Samuel Ross completing his vehicle inspection and Daniel Yates organizing equipment in the back of his Honda Civic. The scene represented the peaceful routine of highway travel that millions of Americans experience every day, with multiple individuals pursuing their separate journeys while briefly sharing the same location. None of the three travelers had any awareness that they were being observed by a predator whose species had ruled North American wilderness areas for thousands of years before the first European settlers arrived on the continent. Laura's phone rang at 9:38 a.m. with a call from Dr. Jennifer Martinez, her supervisor at the Bozeman Trauma Center. Jennifer was calling to confirm Laura's arrival time and to brief her on a complex trauma case that had been admitted during the night shift. A construction worker had suffered severe injuries in a fall from scaffolding, and the case would require Laura's expertise in thoracic surgery when she arrived at the hospital. The conversation with Jennifer lasted approximately 3 minutes and covered the patient's injuries, current condition, and treatment plan. Laura took notes on a small pad she carried in her purse, asking specific questions about the patient's respiratory status and the surgical interventions that had been performed during the night. The complexity of the case energized Laura professionally, reminding her why she'd chosen emergency medicine despite its emotional and physical demands. During her phone conversation, Laura unconsciously opened the package of trail mix and began consuming small handfuls of the mixture. The motion of repeatedly reaching into the package and bringing food to her mouth created visual and olfactory signals that wildlife behaviorists would later identify as potentially triggering to an observing predator. Bears are naturally attracted to feeding behavior in other animals, and the sight of Laura consuming food may have influenced Bear 441's subsequent decision-making process. Daniel Yates had completed his vehicle organization and was preparing to continue his journey when he decided to take advantage of the rest area's restroom facilities. His drive to Spokane represented another 4 hours of highway travel, and his experience during the winter months had taught him the wisdom of taking advantage of clean, heated restroom facilities whenever they were available. Mountain highways offered limited services, and weather conditions could change rapidly enough to make travel dangerous or impossible. Daniel's decision to use the restroom at 9:41 a.m. would place him in the most vulnerable possible position when Bear 441 made his final approach toward the rest area's infrastructure. The restroom building was constructed of cinder block and steel, with heavy wooden doors designed to withstand harsh weather conditions. The men's restroom contained 2 stalls and 2 urinals, with a single entrance-exit door that opened outward into the main parking area. The design of the restroom facilities would later become a critical factor in the attack sequence, as the heavy doors and solid construction that provided protection from Montana's severe weather also created an enclosed space with limited escape routes. Wildlife experts would note that bears instinctively seek to corner their prey in confined spaces, and the restroom's layout inadvertently created ideal conditions for a predator ambush. Samuel Ross entered the visitor center at 9:42 a.m., to purchase coffee and update his electronic logs using the free wireless internet service provided by the Montana Department of Transportation. Federal regulations required commercial drivers to maintain detailed records of their driving times, rest periods, and duty status, and Samuel's carrier company monitored compliance through electronic logging devices installed in all company vehicles. Samuel's electronic logs showed that he had been on duty for 11 hours and 17 minutes, with 9 hours and 23 minutes of actual driving time. Federal regulations would require him to take a mandatory 10-hour rest period within the next 2 hours, and he planned to reach Seattle and complete his delivery before the driving time limit expired. The timing was tight but manageable, assuming he encountered no significant delays during the remainder of his journey. The visitor center's vending machines accepted both cash and credit cards, and Samuel selected a large coffee and a package of donuts to supplement the meal that Margaret had prepared. His caffeine consumption had increased over the years as the physical demands of long-haul driving had accumulated, and he was aware that his coffee habit represented both a performance enhancement and a potential health concern. He and Margaret had discussed strategies for reducing his caffeine dependence as part of their retirement planning. While Samuel completed his electronic log updates, Bear 441's collar data recorded another significant position change at 9:44 a.m. The Bear had moved to within 15 yards of the visitor center, positioning himself behind a maintenance shed that housed electrical equipment and landscaping tools. This location provided excellent concealment while offering direct access to the main pedestrian pathways connecting the parking area, visitor center, and restroom facilities. Bear 441's proximity to human activity had reached a critical threshold that should have triggered immediate defensive responses from any humans in the area. However, the Bear's concealment was so effective that none of the three travelers had any awareness of his presence. Grizzly bears are capable of moving with surprising stealth for animals of their size, and Bear 441's approach had been executed with the patience and skill of an apex predator that had refined his hunting techniques over 15 years of successful survival in some of the most challenging wilderness environments in North America. The Bear's decision to continue approaching despite the presence of multiple humans represented a fundamental breakdown in the species' normal avoidance behavior. Post-incident analysis would reveal that Bear 441 had demonstrated increasingly aggressive responses to human presence over the previous 18 months. But these behavioral changes had not been properly documented or communicated to wildlife management authorities. The failure of the monitoring and response system would later result in significant changes to grizzly bear management protocols throughout the region. Dr. Laura Chen finished her coffee and trail mix at 9:46 a.m. and began gathering her belongings to continue her journey to Bozeman. Her brief rest at the picnic table had provided the mental reset she'd intended, and she felt ready to tackle the complex trauma case that awaited her at the hospital. Laura's commitment to her patients and her profession had been one of the factors that had contributed to the dissolution of her marriage, as Marcus had repeatedly argued that her dedication to medicine prevented her from being fully present for their family. Laura's marriage to Marcus had been a source of both support and conflict throughout her medical career. Marcus had been proud of her achievements and had provided stable support during the demanding years of medical school and residency. But he had also harbored resentment about the time and emotional energy that medicine required. Their arguments had intensified after Emma's birth, when Laura's return to full-time emergency medicine had created childcare challenges and reduced the time available for family activities. The divorce settlement had been acrimonious, with Marcus arguing that Laura's career priorities had damaged their daughter's emotional development and stability. Laura had countered that her medical career provided both financial security and a positive role model for Emma, demonstrating that women could pursue challenging professional goals while maintaining their commitment to family. The family court had ultimately crafted a custody arrangement that acknowledged both parents' legitimate concerns while prioritizing Emma's needs and best interests. As Laura walked toward her car, she passed Daniel Yates, who was entering the men's restroom. Their brief eye contact resulted in the polite nod that strangers typically exchange in public spaces, but neither spoke nor showed any inclination to engage in conversation. Laura would later remember this moment with devastating clarity, as it represented her final opportunity to potentially alter the sequence of events that was about to unfold. Daniel's entry into the men's restroom at 9:47 a.m. placed him in a confined space with a single exit door, just as Bear 441 began his final approach toward the rest area's main infrastructure. The timing of these events would later be described by investigators as catastrophically unfortunate, as Daniel's vulnerability was maximized at the exact moment when the bear's aggressive behavior reached its climax. The men's restroom was illuminated by fluorescent lighting, powered by the rest area's electrical system, and it contained the typical amenities found in highway facilities: 2 toilet stalls with locking doors, 2 urinals mounted on the wall, a sink with hot and cold running water, an electric hand dryer, and a wall-mounted dispenser for paper towels. The floor was constructed of sealed concrete, and the walls were painted cinder block that provided excellent durability but limited sound absorption. Daniel selected the stall farthest from the entrance door, a decision that would later prove to be both fortunate and unfortunate. The location provided him with maximum distance from the bear's initial entry point, potentially giving him additional seconds to react to the attack, but it also placed him in the most confined portion of the restroom with the greatest distance to travel to reach the exit door. Bear 441's collar data recorded his final position change at 9:48 a.m., indicating movement from behind the maintenance shed directly toward the restroom building. The bear's approach path took him across approximately 20 yards of open ground, making him visible to anyone who happened to be looking in his direction. However, Laura Chen was focused on unlocking her car, Samuel Ross was inside the visitor center completing his log updates, and Daniel Yates was inside the restroom, leaving no witnesses to observe the bear's final approach. The bear's movement across the open parking area represented the point of no return in the sequence of events that would result in the most violent human-wildlife conflict incident in Montana's recorded history. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that Bear 441's decision to abandon concealment and approach human infrastructure in broad daylight indicated a complete breakdown in the species' normal risk assessment mechanisms. Samuel Ross emerged from the visitor center at 9:49 a.m., carrying his coffee and donuts and walking toward his truck to continue his journey to Seattle. His electronic logs had been successfully updated, and his vehicle inspection had revealed no maintenance issues that would affect his ability to complete the delivery on schedule. Samuel's experience and professionalism had served him well throughout his 30-year career, and he felt confident about the remainder of his journey. As Samuel walked toward his truck, he observed Laura Chen unlocking her silver Camry and preparing to depart. Samuel's attention was focused on his own vehicle and his planned route to Seattle, and he had no awareness that a 430-pound grizzly bear was approaching the restroom building where Daniel Yates was completely vulnerable to attack. Samuel's route to his truck took him within 20 feet of the restroom building, but his attention was focused on avoiding potential obstacles in the parking area and planning his exit strategy back onto Interstate 90. The diesel engine in his Ford F-350 required several minutes of warm-up time during cold weather conditions, and Samuel was mentally rehearsing his departure routine when the first sounds of the attack reached his ears. The initial sounds were so unexpected and unfamiliar that Samuel's brain required several seconds to process what he was hearing. The combination of splintering wood, metal stress, and animal vocalizations created an auditory signature unlike anything in Samuel's experience. His first thought was that a vehicle accident had occurred, possibly involving a collision with the restroom building, but the ongoing nature of the sounds quickly ruled out that explanation. Bear 441's attack on the men's restroom door began at 9:49 a.m. and 37 seconds, according to the timestamp data from Samuel's electronic logging device, which recorded sudden acceleration in his heart rate detected by the fitness monitor he wore as part of his company's wellness program. The bear's initial assault on the door involved using his body weight and powerful shoulder muscles to test the structural integrity of the barrier between himself and his intended prey. The restroom door was constructed of heavy timber with steel reinforcing hardware designed to withstand harsh weather conditions and potential vandalism, but not engineered to resist attack by a large carnivore. Bear 441's initial impacts created stress fractures in the doorframe and caused the locking mechanism to shift within its mounting hardware. The wooden door itself began to show compression damage where the bear's shoulder struck the surface. Daniel Yates heard the first impact while he was still inside the toilet stall, and his initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. The sound could have been caused by wind slamming the door or by another traveler entering the restroom with excessive force. Daniel called out, "Hello?" in a voice that was curious rather than frightened, expecting to hear a response from another person who might have accidentally caused the noise. The second impact occurred just 4 seconds after the first, and the increased violence of the sound immediately triggered Daniel's fight-or-flight response. The combination of splintering wood and what he now recognized as animal vocalizations created a flood of adrenaline that sharpened his senses and accelerated his heart rate to over 140 beats per minute. Daniel's body began producing stress hormones that would enhance his physical performance while simultaneously impairing his cognitive function. Daniel shouted, "What's happening?" Received no human response, but the continuing sounds of destruction made it clear that something was attempting to break through the restroom door. Daniel's mind raced through possible explanations: vandalism, accident, structural failure, or animal attack. The animal attack scenario seemed least likely until he heard the unmistakable sound of a large animal's breathing and vocalizations through the increasingly damaged door. Laura Chen was starting her car engine when she heard the sounds of the attack beginning. Her medical training had exposed her to a wide variety of emergency situations, and the combination of structural destruction and animal sounds immediately triggered her professional response protocols. Laura shut off her engine and exited her vehicle, moving toward the source of the disturbance with the intention of providing assistance if someone had been injured. Laura's decision to approach the crisis rather than flee would later be described as both heroic and tragic. Her medical training and professional ethics compelled her to respond to potential emergencies, but her lack of wilderness experience left her unprepared for the reality of confronting a predator attack. Laura's medical bag contained equipment that could save human lives, but nothing that could stop a grizzly bear attack in progress. Samuel Ross dropped his coffee and donuts when he realized that the sounds were coming from the restroom building and that someone was trapped inside during what was clearly an animal attack. Samuel's military service during the Gulf War had exposed him to combat situations, and his training kicked in automatically as he assessed the situation and considered his options for providing assistance. Samuel's truck contained several tools that could potentially be used as weapons, including a tire iron, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a CB radio that could be used to summon help. However, the distance to his truck and the time required to retrieve weapons would likely exceed the time available before the bear succeeded in breaking through the restroom door. Samuel's decision to respond immediately with whatever resources were immediately available would later be credited with saving Daniel Yates's life. Bear 441's third assault on the restroom door occurred at 9:50 a.m. and 14 seconds, and the accumulated damage finally compromised the structural integrity of the barrier. The door frame separated from the wall mounting, creating a gap wide enough for the bear to insert his claws and begin pulling the door apart. The sound of splintering wood increased dramatically as the bear's powerful limbs tore through timber that had been seasoned and treated to withstand decades of Montana weather. Daniel Yates had climbed onto the toilet seat in his stall, attempting to minimize his profile and create distance between himself and the compromised door. His cell phone showed no signal in the concrete block building, preventing him from calling for help or communicating his situation to anyone outside. Daniel's mind was running through escape scenarios, but the single exit design of the restroom left him with no options other than attempting to defend himself or hoping that the door would hold until help arrived. The sound of the door being torn apart was accompanied by the bear's vocalizations, which included huffing, woofing, and jaw-popping sounds that indicated high levels of agitation and aggressive intent. Daniel had never heard these sounds before, but some primitive part of his brain recognized them as the vocalizations of a large predator, triggering terror responses that had been programmed into human DNA over millions of years of evolution. Daniel's hands were shaking as he searched his pockets for anything that could be used as a weapon. His keychain included a small LED flashlight and a pocket knife with a 2-inch blade, neither of which would be effective against a grizzly bear. His winter gloves and ski jacket were in his car, and he was wearing only jeans, a t-shirt, and lightweight hiking boots that provided minimal protection against claws and teeth. Samuel Ross reached the restroom building at 9:50 a.m. and 28 seconds, arriving just as the bear succeeded in creating a gap large enough to fit his head and shoulders through the damaged door. Samuel's first clear view of Bear 441 confirmed his worst fears about the nature of the emergency. The bear was enormous, clearly agitated, and completely focused on gaining access to the interior of the restroom where Daniel was trapped. Samuel's combat experience had taught him that successful intervention in life-threatening situations required immediate action and complete commitment to the chosen course of action. Hesitation or half measures typically resulted in failure and additional casualties. Samuel grabbed a broken piece of concrete from a nearby landscaping border and hurled it at the bear's head with all the force he could generate. The concrete fragment struck Bear 441 in the left shoulder, causing the bear to pause his assault on the door and turn toward Samuel with a focus that was both intelligent and terrifying. Samuel realized that he had successfully diverted the bear's attention from Daniel, but had simultaneously made himself the primary target of a predator that outweighed him by more than 200 pounds and possessed natural weapons that could kill a human in seconds. Bear 441's response to Samuel's intervention was immediate and decisive. The bear abandoned his assault on the restroom door and charged toward Samuel with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of his size. Grizzly bears can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour over short distances, and Bear 441 covered the 20 feet between the restroom door and Samuel's position in less than 2 seconds. Samuel's military training had prepared him for many combat scenarios, but nothing in his experience had equipped him to face a charging grizzly bear with no weapons and no escape route. Samuel's body was flooded with adrenaline as he prepared to fight for his life against an opponent that possessed every possible advantage in size, strength, speed, and natural armament. Dr. Laura Chen reached the scene just as Bear 441 began his charge towards Samuel Ross. Laura's medical training had exposed her to violence and trauma, but nothing had prepared her for witnessing an apex predator attacking a human being. Laura's first instinct was to flee, but her professional training and personal ethics prevented her from abandoning Samuel to face the bear alone. Laura began shouting and waving her arms in an attempt to distract the bear and disrupt his focus on Samuel. Wildlife experts recommend making noise and appearing as large as possible when confronting bears, and Laura's actions represented textbook defensive behavior. However, Bear 441's level of aggression and commitment to his attack had progressed beyond the point where normal defensive measures would be effective. Bear 441's charge brought him into contact with Samuel Ross at 9:50 a.m. and 43 seconds, beginning the first of 3 separate mauling incidents that would unfold over the next 6 minutes. Samuel attempted to protect his head and torso by falling backward and rolling into a defensive position, but the bear's momentum carried both combatants to the ground in a tangle of claws, teeth, and human limbs. The bear's initial attack focused on Samuel's legs and lower torso, with powerful swipes from claws that were over 4 inches long and designed to tear through tree bark and frozen ground. Samuel's jeans and leather belt provided minimal protection against weapons that had evolved to disable large ungulates. The first claw strikes opened wounds on Samuel's thighs that would require over 60 stitches to close, assuming he survived the encounter. Samuel's screams of pain and terror carried across the rest area, alerting other travelers on the interstate to the presence of an emergency. 3 vehicles slowed and pulled into the rest area within the first minute of the attack, their drivers initially confused about the nature of the crisis, but quickly recognizing that someone needed immediate assistance. Daniel Yates used the bear's focus on Samuel as an opportunity to escape from the restroom through the gap that Bear 441 had torn in the door. Daniel's emergence from the building attracted the bear's attention just as Samuel was beginning to lose consciousness from blood loss and shock. Bear 441's predatory instincts were triggered by the movement of new prey, and the bear abandoned Samuel to pursue Daniel across the parking area. Daniel's attempt to reach his Honda Civic was hampered by injuries he had sustained while climbing through the damaged door frame, including cuts on his hands and arms from splintered wood and bent metal. Daniel's adrenaline levels masked the pain of these injuries, but they impaired his grip strength and coordination as he fumbled with his car keys while running across the asphalt parking surface. Bear 441's pursuit of Daniel demonstrated the explosive acceleration and endurance that make grizzly bears among the most effective predators in North America. The bear's powerful limbs propelled him across the parking area with a loping gait that covered ground faster than Daniel could run, despite Daniel's youth and athletic conditioning from his winter of ski instruction. Dr. Laura Chen's medical training compelled her to attempt treatment of Samuel Ross's injuries, even as Bear 441 continued his pursuit of Daniel Yates. Laura's medical bag contained hemostatic agents and pressure bandages that could potentially control Samuel's bleeding, but treating him would require her to remain in the immediate vicinity of the ongoing bear attack. Laura's decision to prioritize patient care over personal safety reflected both her medical ethics and her professional competence under extreme stress. Laura began applying pressure bandages to Samuel's most severe wounds, while continuously monitoring the bear's position and preparing to defend herself and her patient if the bear returned. Samuel's injuries included multiple lacerations on his legs and torso, with the most serious wound involving damage to his femoral artery that was causing rapid blood loss. Laura's immediate priority was controlling this hemorrhage, as Samuel would bleed to death within minutes if the arterial damage was not addressed. Laura's training and experience allowed her to maintain focus on medical procedures despite the ongoing chaos of the bear attack. Daniel Yates reached his Honda Civic at 9:51 a.m. and 17 seconds, but his coordination was too impaired by adrenaline and panic to successfully unlock and start the vehicle. Daniel's fine motor skills had been degraded by stress hormones, and the simple task of inserting his key into the door lock became impossibly complex under the pressure of the approaching predator. Bear 441 reached Daniel's position just as Daniel succeeded in unlocking his car door. The bear's attack on Daniel began with a powerful swipe that knocked Daniel away from the vehicle and onto the asphalt surface of the parking area. The impact with the ground caused additional injuries, including abrasions and contusions that would compound the damage inflicted by the bear's claws and teeth. Daniel's second encounter with Bear 441 was more violent than the bear's initial attack on Samuel, as the bear's aggression levels had continued to escalate throughout the incident. The bear's attack on Daniel included biting behavior that had not been present during the assault on Samuel, indicating a progression from defensive aggression to predatory behavior that represented the most dangerous possible scenario for human victims. The arrival of additional vehicles at the rest area provided potential assistance but also created additional targets for the bear's aggression. The first vehicle to arrive contained a family of 4 traveling from Minnesota to Seattle, including 2 children ages 8 and 12, who were exposed to the traumatic sight and sounds of the ongoing attack. The family's father, Michael Thompson, had military experience and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Michael Thompson's intervention involved using his pickup truck as both a weapon and a barrier between the bear and the human victims. Thompson drove his vehicle directly toward Bear 441, using the horn and engine noise to create auditory stress that disrupted the bear's attack behavior. The truck's approach forced the bear to choose between continuing his assault on Daniel and responding to the new threat represented by the vehicle. Bear 441's response to the truck was to abandon Daniel and charge toward the new threat, demonstrating the territorial aggression that often characterizes grizzly bear behavior when they perceive threats to their dominance. The bear's charge toward Thompson's truck brought him into contact with the vehicle's front bumper, resulting in a collision that stunned the bear and provided the first interruption in his aggressive behavior since the attack began. The collision between Bear 441 and Thompson's truck occurred at 9:52 a.m. and 31 seconds, marking the beginning of a brief pause in active hostilities that allowed Laura Chen to continue treating Samuel Ross while other bystanders attempted to assist Daniel Yates. The bear's impact with the truck had not caused serious injury, but it had disrupted his focus and created temporary confusion about the primary targets of his aggression. Daniel Yates used the bear's distraction to crawl toward the restroom building, seeking shelter behind the concrete block construction that had initially failed to protect him, but now offered concealment from the bear's view. Daniel's injuries included severe lacerations on his back and shoulders where the bear's claws had penetrated his clothing, as well as puncture wounds from the bear's teeth that had not fully penetrated but had caused significant tissue damage. Laura Chen's assessment of Samuel Ross revealed life-threatening injuries that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from hemorrhagic shock. Samuel's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, his heart rate was increasing beyond safe limits, and his level of consciousness was decreasing in a pattern that indicated severe blood loss. Laura's field treatment was buying time, but Samuel would need hospital care within minutes to survive his injuries. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that someone had successfully contacted emergency services, though the nearest paramedic unit was stationed over 20 miles away in Butte. The response time for advanced life support would exceed 30 minutes under ideal conditions, and the ongoing presence of an aggressive bear would complicate any rescue efforts until wildlife authorities could neutralize the threat. Bear 441's recovery from his collision with Thompson's truck occurred within 45 seconds of the impact, and the bear's behavior immediately returned to aggressive patterns as he sought to re-establish dominance over the rest area environment. The bear's focus shifted between multiple potential targets, including the humans who were visible in the parking area and the vehicles that had been used to disrupt his attacks. Michael Thompson's family remained inside their pickup truck, which provided excellent protection from the bear but limited their ability to assist the injured victims. Thompson's wife, Sarah, was using her cell phone to provide ongoing updates to emergency dispatchers while their children remained hidden below the level of the windows to avoid attracting the bear's attention. The emergency dispatch center in Butte was coordinating responses from multiple agencies, including paramedics, sheriff's deputies, Montana Fish and Game Wildlife, and parks officers, and the Montana Highway Patrol. The complexity of the incident required specialized expertise in both emergency medical response and wildlife management, creating coordination challenges that would delay effective intervention. Bear 441's renewed aggression manifested as territorial behavior around the rest area, with the bear moving between different areas of the facility and investigating each of the human victims and their vehicles. The bear's behavior indicated that he had claimed the rest area as his territory and was defending it against all intruders, a pattern that wildlife experts would later describe as unprecedented in recorded grizzly bear behavior. Dr. Laura Chen's continued treatment of Samuel Ross was complicated by the bear's proximity and unpredictable movements. Laura had succeeded in controlling Samuel's arterial bleeding, but he required intravenous fluids and blood replacement therapy that could not be provided in a field environment. Laura's medical bag contained medications that could support Samuel's cardiovascular system, but administering them would require time and concentration that might not be available. Daniel Yates had crawled behind the restroom building and was attempting to use his cell phone to contact emergency services, but his injuries had impaired his manual dexterity, and the blood from his wounds was interfering with the phone's touchscreen operation. Daniel's efforts to communicate his location and the nature of the emergency were frustrated by both physical limitations and the inadequate cell phone coverage in the mountainous terrain. The arrival of a second family group at the rest area created additional potential victims and witnesses to the ongoing attack. The second vehicle contained an elderly couple from California who had stopped to use the restroom facilities and were completely unprepared for the wildlife emergency that was in progress. The couple's initial reaction was confusion rather than fear, as they had no frame of reference for understanding what they were observing. Bear 441's response to the new arrivals was immediate and aggressive, with the bear charging toward their vehicle with the same intensity he had shown during his earlier attacks on human victims. The elderly couple's sedan provided less protection than Thompson's pickup truck, and the bear's assault on their vehicle included clawing at the windows and body panels while attempting to gain access to the interior. The bear's attack on the second vehicle demonstrated his commitment to maintaining control over the rest area environment and his willingness to engage multiple threats simultaneously. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that this pattern of behavior was consistent with a bear that had lost all fear of humans and had begun to view them as competitors for territory rather than threats to be avoided. The elderly couple's terrified screams added to the cacophony of sounds that was attracting attention from passing traffic on Interstate 90. Multiple vehicles were slowing or stopping to observe the emergency, creating potential traffic hazards and additional targets for the bear's aggression. The Montana Highway Patrol was already en route to manage traffic flow and prevent secondary accidents. Laura Chen realized that Samuel Ross required immediate evacuation to a hospital facility, but moving him would expose both of them to renewed attack by Bear 441. Laura's medical judgment indicated that Samuel's chances of survival were decreasing with each passing minute, but attempting to transport him without neutralizing the bear threat would likely result in additional casualties. The sound of approaching helicopters indicated that multiple air units were responding to the emergency, including medical evacuation aircraft and law enforcement aircraft equipped with specialized equipment for wildlife management. The helicopter noise further agitated Bear 441, adding another stressor to an already volatile situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond the control of the civilian responders. Bear 441's reaction to the helicopter noise was to increase his aggressive behavior toward all targets in the rest area, including renewed attacks on the vehicles containing civilians and movements toward the area where Laura was treating Samuel. The bear's escalating aggression indicated that the presence of additional stimuli was overwhelming his ability to process threats and respond rationally. At 9:54 a.m. and 12 seconds, Bear 441 initiated his final attack sequence, charging directly toward Dr. Laura Chen and the injured Samuel Ross with clear predatory intent. Laura's position while treating Samuel had left her vulnerable to attack, and the bear's approach gave her less than 3 seconds to react before impact. Laura's decision to shield Samuel's body with her own represented both medical ethics and personal courage under circumstances that would have overwhelmed most people. Laura's action provided Samuel with protection from the bear's initial assault, but exposed her to the full force of Bear 441's claws and teeth during what would become the most violent phase of the entire attack sequence. Bear 441's assault on Laura Chen lasted 47 seconds and inflicted injuries that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. The bear's attack included both clawing and biting behavior, with the most serious injuries occurring when the bear's teeth penetrated Laura's shoulder and upper arm, causing damage to bone, muscle, and nervous tissue that would permanently impair her surgical capabilities. Laura's medical training allowed her to maintain consciousness and continue protecting Samuel even while sustaining life-threatening injuries. Laura's knowledge of anatomy helped her position her body to protect vital organs while accepting damage to extremities that could be surgically repaired. Laura's actions during this phase of the attack would later be recognized with multiple awards for heroism and professional excellence. The arrival of the first Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officer occurred at 9:55 a.m. and 37 seconds, just as Bear 441's attack on Laura was reaching its peak intensity. Officer James Mitchell was equipped with both lethal and non-lethal weapons specifically designed for wildlife management, including bear spray, tranquilizer darts, and a high-powered rifle loaded with ammunition capable of stopping a charging grizzly. Officer Mitchell's assessment of the situation required split-second decision-making about the appropriate level of force needed to neutralize Bear 441 without causing additional harm to the human victims. The bear's position directly over Laura Chen eliminated the possibility of using tranquilizer darts or bear spray without affecting the victim, leaving lethal force as the only viable option for stopping the attack. Mitchell's first rifle shot struck Bear 441 in the upper torso at 9:55 a.m. and 52 seconds, causing immediate disruption of the bear's attack behavior but not immediately incapacitating the animal. Wounded grizzly bears often become more dangerous rather than less aggressive, and Bear 441's response to being shot was to abandon Laura and charge directly toward Officer Mitchell with increased fury. The charging wounded bear represented the most dangerous possible scenario for a wildlife officer, as Bear 441's combination of size, aggression, and injury created a predator that was both desperate and capable of inflicting fatal injuries on armed responders. Officer Mitchell's training and experience were tested to their limits as he prepared to deliver additional shots while maintaining his position to protect the civilian casualties. Mitchell's second and third shots struck Bear 441 center mass at ranges of less than 20 feet, finally delivering enough trauma to stop the bear's charge and end his ability to continue attacking human victims. Bear 441 collapsed 15 feet from Officer Mitchell's position at 9:56 a.m. and 18 seconds, marking the end of the active attack phase that had lasted 6 minutes and 41 seconds. The immediate aftermath of Bear 441's death involved securing the scene, providing medical treatment to the injured victims, and beginning the complex investigation that would ultimately reshape wildlife management policies throughout Montana. The rest area was declared a crime scene under the jurisdiction of multiple agencies, and access was restricted to authorized personnel only. Dr. Laura Chen's injuries required immediate medical evacuation by helicopter to the trauma center in Bozeman, the same facility where she was scheduled to begin her shift treating other patients. The irony of Laura becoming a patient at her own hospital was not lost on her colleagues, who mobilized every available resource to provide her with the same level of care she had provided to countless others throughout her career. Samuel Ross was transported by ground ambulance to the same trauma center, his condition stabilized by Laura's field treatment, but still requiring multiple surgeries to repair the damage inflicted by Bear 441's claws. Samuel's recovery would take 8 months and would end his trucking career, but he would survive to see his planned retirement and the ranch that he and Margaret had purchased outside Bozeman. Daniel Yates's injuries were less severe than those sustained by Laura and Samuel, but he required extensive treatment for lacerations, puncture wounds, and psychological trauma that would affect him for years following the attack. Daniel's planned return to Spokane was delayed by 6 weeks of hospitalization and rehabilitation, during which time his parents maintained a constant presence at his bedside. The investigation into the circumstances that led to Bear 441's attack would reveal multiple systemic failures in wildlife management, early warning systems, and interagency communication that had allowed a dangerous situation to develop without appropriate intervention. The findings would result in policy changes, personnel actions, and legal settlements that would total over $40 million. Bear 441's body was transported to the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Laboratory for comprehensive examination, including necropsy procedures designed to determine whether disease, injury, or environmental factors had influenced his aggressive behavior. The examination would reveal no abnormalities that could explain the bear's decision to attack humans, deepening the mystery of why a healthy adult grizzly had abandoned normal avoidance behavior. The media coverage of the Pipestone Rest Area attack would continue for months, with national news outlets focusing on the heroism displayed by Dr. Laura Chen and the systemic failures that had enabled the tragedy. The story would become a case study in crisis management, emergency response, and the ongoing challenges of managing human-wildlife conflicts in the modern American West. Laura Chen's recovery would require 14 months and 9 separate surgeries to repair the damage inflicted by Bear 441's teeth and claws. Her injuries would end her career as a surgeon, but she would eventually return to medicine as an emergency room physician, specializing in trauma cases. Laura's experience as both doctor and patient would give her unique insights into the psychological aspects of trauma recovery. Samuel Ross would use his settlement money to purchase additional acreage for the ranch he and Margaret had planned, creating a wildlife sanctuary dedicated to educating the public about the importance of proper human-wildlife interaction protocols. Samuel's facility would become a model for other educational programs throughout the region. Daniel Yates would eventually return to Big Sky Resort for a second winter season, but his experience with Bear 441 would permanently alter his relationship with wilderness environments. Daniel would become an advocate for improved wildlife management and would work with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to develop better early warning systems for dangerous wildlife activity. The Pipestone Rest Area would be closed for 8 months following the attack, undergoing extensive modifications designed to prevent similar incidents. The redesigned facility would include bear-resistant waste containers, enhanced lighting, emergency communication systems, and structural modifications to the restroom buildings that would prevent large animals from gaining access. Officer James Mitchell would receive commendation for his actions during the bear attack, but the psychological impact of the incident would lead him to request transfer to a different division within Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. Mitchell's experience would contribute to enhanced training programs for wildlife officers throughout the state. The families who witnessed the attack would require extensive counseling and psychological support to process the trauma of observing extreme violence perpetrated by a wild animal. Several of the witnesses would develop post-traumatic stress disorder and would require ongoing treatment for anxiety and depression related to their experiences. The legal proceedings following the attack would include wrongful death lawsuits, negligence claims against multiple government agencies, and workers' compensation claims for the injured victims. The litigation would continue for over 5 years and would establish important precedents for government liability in wildlife management cases. The scientific study of Bear 441's behavior would contribute to new understanding of grizzly bear psychology and the factors that can lead to aggressive interactions with humans. The research findings would influence wildlife management practices throughout North America and would be incorporated into educational programs for both the general public and wildlife professionals. The memorial service for the 3 fatalities would be attended by over 800 people, including wildlife officials, emergency responders, and members of the communities that had been affected by the tragedy. The service would emphasize both the heroism displayed during the crisis and the ongoing need for improved coexistence between humans and wildlife. Dr. Laura Chen would eventually write a book about her experience titled When Wilderness Strikes Back, A Doctor's Journey from Healer to Victim and Back Again. The book would become a bestseller and would contribute to national conversations about wildlife management, emergency preparedness, and the psychological aspects of trauma recovery. Samuel Ross and Margaret would establish the Bear 441 Memorial Foundation, dedicated to funding research into human-wildlife conflict prevention and supporting the families of victims of wildlife attacks. The foundation would provide scholarships for wildlife biology students and would fund the development of new technologies for monitoring dangerous wildlife activity. Daniel Yates would complete a degree in wildlife biology and would work for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks as a human-wildlife conflict specialist. His personal experience with bear attack would give him unique credibility when working with communities affected by dangerous wildlife activity, and his educational programs would reach thousands of residents and visitors to bear country. The Interstate 90 corridor through Montana would receive enhanced wildlife monitoring and early warning systems designed to prevent similar incidents at other rest areas and highway facilities. The new systems would include motion sensors, automated alerts, and rapid response protocols that would significantly reduce the risk of dangerous wildlife encounters. The story of the Pipestone Rest Area attack would become part of the folklore of the American West, a reminder that the wilderness that draws millions of visitors to Montana each year remains a place where nature's power can assert itself with devastating consequences. The incident would serve as a catalyst for improved understanding between humans and wildlife, even as it demonstrated the terrible cost of that education. Bear 441's GPS collar data would continue to provide valuable information about grizzly bear behavior patterns for years following his death, as researchers analyzed the movement patterns and decision-making processes that had led to the tragic confrontation. The data would contribute to new models for predicting dangerous wildlife behavior and preventing similar incidents in the future. The survivors of the Pipestone Rest Area attack would form lasting bonds forged by their shared experience of surviving one of the most violent wildlife encounters in Montana's history. Their annual reunion would become a celebration of survival, resilience, and the human capacity to heal and grow from even the most traumatic experiences. The rest area would eventually reopen with a memorial garden dedicated to the victims and survivors of the bear attack, featuring native plants and educational displays about wildlife safety and the importance of respecting the natural world. The memorial would serve as both a tribute to those affected by the tragedy and a reminder to future visitors about the ongoing reality of life in bear country. The legacy of May 7, 2025 would extend far beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing wildlife policy, emergency response protocols, and public education about wilderness safety throughout the western United States. The lessons learned from Bear 441's attack would save lives for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifice of those who suffered that day would contribute to a safer coexistence between humans and the magnificent predators with whom they share the Montana landscape. The next stories: grizzly bear destroys $1.2 million ranch home, kills elderly couple, June 3rd, 2025. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Gallatin Valley as Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos drove her patrol car down the winding gravel road that led to the Lewis Ranch. The radio crackled with static, and she adjusted the volume, still processing the call that had come in 20 minutes earlier. Possible animal attack, significant property damage, 2 elderly residents unaccounted for. The words echoed in her mind as she navigated the familiar curves of Bridger Canyon Road, a route she had traveled countless times during her 8 years with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department. Maria Elena Santos had grown up in Bozeman, Montana, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had settled in the valley in the 1970s. Her father, Roberto, had worked construction, while her mother, Carmen, cleaned houses for the wealthy families who built their dream homes in the foothills of the Bridger Mountains. At 34, Maria had seen her share of wildlife encounters gone wrong, but something about this call felt different. The dispatcher, Jennifer Kowalski, had struggled to keep her voice steady as she relayed the information from the initial 911 call. The caller had been James Mitchell, a local hay contractor who delivered feed to ranchers throughout the valley. His voice had been shaking when he called from his cell phone at 6:47 a.m. "There's something real wrong up at the Lewis place," he had told Jennifer. "The front of their house looks like it got hit by a wrecking ball, and I can see blood on the deck. Harold's truck is here, but nobody's answering when I holler. I ain't going any closer. There's tracks in the dirt that look like they came from something big." As Maria rounded the final bend before the Lewis property, she could see James Mitchell's green Ford pickup parked at the edge of the gravel driveway, about 200 yards from the main house. The 62-year-old contractor was leaning against his truck, his weathered face pale despite decades of working under the Montana sun. He raised his hand to wave her down as she approached, and she could see the relief in his eyes as she pulled up beside him. "Thank God you're here, Maria," James said, his voice still carrying the tremor she had heard described by the dispatcher. "I've been delivering hay to Harold and Patricia for going on 12 years now, and I ain't never seen anything like this." He gestured toward the house with a shaking hand. "Take a look for yourself, but I'm telling you, something terrible happened here." Maria stepped out of her patrol car and immediately noticed the silence. The Lewis Ranch was typically alive with the sounds of Patricia's chickens and the gentle lowing of their small herd of Black Angus cattle. But this morning, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant call of a red-winged blackbird perched on a fence post. She reached for her radio and keyed the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm on scene at the Lewis residence. I'm going to need backup and possibly the coroner. Also, contact Fish, Wildlife and Parks. We may have a predator situation here." Jennifer's voice crackled back through the radio. "Copy that, Maria. I've got Deputy Clark en route. ETA 15 minutes. Should I contact the medical examiner?" "Affirmative. And see if you can raise someone from FWP who knows about bear behavior. This looks like it might be more than just property damage." Harold Benjamin Lewis and Patricia Ann Lewis had been pillars of the Bozeman community for over 30 years. Harold, born in 1949 in Billings, had moved to the Gallatin Valley in 1987 after selling his successful agricultural equipment business in eastern Montana. He had met Patricia, a retired elementary school teacher originally from Great Falls, at a church social in 1990, and they had married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the First Presbyterian Church on West Olive Street. The couple had purchased their 320-acre ranch in 1995, using the proceeds from Harold's business sale to build their dream home and establish a small cattle operation. The house, designed by a prominent Bozeman architect named David Sterling, was a stunning 4,200-square-foot log and stone structure that perfectly complemented the natural beauty of the surrounding landscape. Positioned on a slight rise overlooking Bridger Creek, the home featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Bridger Mountains to the north and the Gallatin Range to the south. Patricia had spent countless hours creating gardens around the house, specializing in native Montana wildflowers and hardy perennials that could withstand the region's harsh winters. Her garden club friends often marveled at her ability to coax blooms from the challenging soil and unpredictable weather. Harold, meanwhile, had focused on building his small herd of cattle and establishing relationships with neighboring ranchers who had welcomed the couple into the tight-knit agricultural community. As Maria approached the house, the extent of the damage became increasingly apparent. The massive front deck, constructed from thick timber beams that Harold had personally selected from a local sawmill, showed clear signs of violent destruction. The heavy wooden railing had been shattered in multiple places, with several sections completely torn away and scattered across the lawn. Deep gouges in the remaining wood showed parallel marks that could only have been made by claws of extraordinary size and strength. The front door, a beautiful custom-made piece crafted from reclaimed barnwood, hung askew on its hinges. The solid wood showed deep scratches and tears, and the heavy wrought-iron handle had been completely ripped away, leaving splintered wood and bent metal in its wake. Through the damaged doorway, Maria could see furniture overturned and scattered throughout what had once been Patricia's carefully decorated living room. Moving carefully around the perimeter of the house, Maria documented the scene with her digital camera while maintaining radio contact with dispatch. The morning air was crisp and clean, typical for early June in the mountains, but there was an underlying scent that made her wrinkle her nose in distaste. It was musky and wild, mixed with something metallic that she recognized all too well from her years in law enforcement. "Dispatch, I'm going to need crime scene tape and a full investigation team," she radioed. "This is definitely more than a simple break-in. The damage pattern is consistent with a large predator, possibly a grizzly bear. I'm seeing claw marks on wood that are over 4 inches long, and there are clear pad prints in the soft soil around the foundation. The tracks in question were immediately visible in Patricia's prized flower bed beneath the living room windows. The massive paw prints, easily 8 inches wide, with clearly defined claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the pad, had compressed the rich soil and crushed several of Patricia's carefully tended lupines and Indian paintbrush. Maria had seen black bear tracks before, but these were significantly larger and showed the distinctive long claws of a grizzly bear. Dr. Emily Richardson, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had been on her way to conduct a routine elk population survey in the Bridger Mountains when she received the call to respond to the Lewis Ranch. At 38, Emily had spent over a decade studying large carnivores throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and she had investigated dozens of bear-human conflicts. However, as she turned onto the gravel road leading to the Lewis property, she felt a familiar tightness in her stomach that always accompanied these types of calls. Emily had grown up in Missoula, the daughter of 2 University of Montana professors who had instilled in her a deep love for the natural world. Her undergraduate degree in wildlife biology had led to a master's degree studying grizzly bear behavior, and she had spent 3 summers in Alaska researching brown bear feeding patterns. She understood better than most people the incredible power and potential danger that these magnificent animals represented. The grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had been steadily recovering since the species was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. From a low of approximately 136 bears in the 1970s, the population had grown to an estimated 720 animals by 2024. This recovery, while celebrated by conservationists, had also led to an increase in human-bear conflicts as the expanding bear population encountered the growing human development throughout the ecosystem. Emily parked her FWP truck next to Maria's patrol car and immediately began assembling her field equipment. Her investigation kit included a GPS unit for mapping the scene, a digital camera with macro lens for documenting tracks and sign, plaster casting materials for preserving footprints, and a collection of measuring tools. She also carried a shotgun loaded with rubber bullets and bear spray, standard equipment for any wildlife professional working in grizzly country. "Deputy Santos," Emily called out as she approached the house. "I'm Dr. Richardson with Fish, Wildlife and Parks. What are we looking at here?" Maria looked up from where she had been photographing a particularly clear paw print near the front steps. "Dr. Richardson, thanks for coming so quickly. I've got to tell you, in 8 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this. The property damage alone is going to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but I'm more concerned about the homeowners. Harold and Patricia Lewis, both in their 70s. No sign of them anywhere, but there's clear evidence of a struggle inside the house." Emily nodded grimly and began her own examination of the scene. The tracks around the house told a clear story to her trained eye. A large, adult grizzly, likely a male based on the size of the prints, had approached the house from the north, following a game trail that led down from the timbered hills behind the property. The bear had circled the house at least twice, leaving clear sign in the soft soil of Patricia's flower beds and vegetable garden. "This animal was here for an extended period," Emily observed, kneeling next to a particularly clear track. "See how deep these impressions are? That suggests a bear weighing at least 600 pounds, possibly more. And the way the tracks overlap indicates the bear made multiple circuits around the house before actually attempting to gain entry." Deputy Frank Clark arrived at 7:23 a.m., his patrol car kicking up a small cloud of dust as he pulled into the driveway. At 45, Frank was a veteran of the Sheriff's Department with over 20 years of experience, including a stint with the U.S. Forest Service Law Enforcement Division before joining the county. He had responded to several bear encounters over the years, but he could immediately tell that this situation was far more serious than the typical garbage can raids or chicken coop break-ins that usually constituted human-bear conflicts in the valley. "Morning, Maria," Frank called out as he approached the house. "Jennifer filled me in on the radio. Where do we stand? We've got a missing elderly couple and what appears to be a grizzly bear that decided to redecorate their living room," Maria replied, attempting to inject a bit of dark humor into the grim situation. "Dr. Richardson here is our bear expert from Fish, Wildlife and Parks. She's been documenting the tracks and sign around the property." Frank surveyed the damaged front of the house and let out a low whistle. "In all my years, I've never seen property damage like this from a wildlife encounter. These folks had a beautiful place here. Patricia Lewis grew the most amazing tomatoes in the county. She brought them to the church potluck every summer." The mention of the church potluck brought home the personal nature of the tragedy for both deputies. Harold and Patricia Lewis were not just statistics in a report. They were neighbors, community members who had touched the lives of countless people throughout the valley. Harold had served on the board of directors for the local farmers market, while Patricia had volunteered as a reading tutor at the elementary school until arthritis in her hands had forced her to retire 2 years earlier. Emily completed her initial examination of the exterior evidence and approached the damaged front door. "I'm going to need to go inside to complete my assessment," she told the deputies. "Based on what I'm seeing out here, this bear exhibited some very unusual behavior. Grizzlies typically avoid human habitation, especially structures as large as this house. For an animal to persist in attempting to gain entry despite the obvious human presence suggests either extreme food motivation or possibly a bear that has lost its natural fear of humans." The interior of the Lewis home told a story of violent destruction that left all 3 investigators momentarily speechless. The front door opened directly into a spacious living room that Patricia had decorated with a mixture of rustic Western pieces and elegant antiques inherited from her grandmother. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth typically home to a carefully arranged collection of brass andirons and vintage tools that Harold had collected over the years. Now, the room looked like it had been struck by a tornado. The heavy leather sofa, which had cost the couple nearly $5,000 3 years earlier, had been overturned and dragged across the room. Deep claw marks scored the leather, and stuffing from the cushions was scattered across the hardwood floors like strange snow. A beautiful Navajo rug that had been Patricia's pride and joy was bunched up in a corner, stained with mud and what appeared to be blood. The coffee table, a sturdy piece crafted from a single slab of reclaimed railroad timber, had been flipped completely over. The thick wood showed fresh gouges where claws had raked across its surface, and the heavy iron legs had gouged deep scratches in the oak flooring. Patricia's collection of art books and photography volumes were scattered throughout the room, their pages torn and scattered like autumn leaves. The destruction pattern is consistent with a bear that was agitated and possibly searching for something, Emily observed, carefully stepping through the debris. Bears are incredibly strong. A large grizzly can flip over a car if sufficiently motivated, but what I'm seeing here goes beyond typical foraging behavior. This looks almost like territorial marking or aggressive display. In the kitchen, the refrigerator had been completely overturned, its contents spilled across the tile floor in a mess of broken glass, spoiled food, and pooled liquids. The solid oak cabinets showed deep claw marks, and several doors had been completely torn from their hinges. Patricia's carefully organized pantry had been ransacked, with broken jars of home-canned vegetables and preserves creating a sticky, aromatic mess that attracted clouds of flies. "Look at this," Maria called from near the kitchen island. She was examining what appeared to be a cell phone, its screen cracked but still functional. This might be Patricia's phone. It looks like she was trying to make a call when whatever happened here took place. Emily carefully bagged the phone as potential evidence, while Frank documented the scene with his camera. The kitchen window above the sink had been shattered from the inside, and there were clear blood smears on the remaining glass fragments. Outside the window, more bear tracks were visible in Patricia's herb garden, and several of her prized rose bushes had been completely destroyed. The hallway leading to the bedrooms showed clear evidence that the bear had explored the entire house. Framed family photographs had been knocked from the walls, their glass scattered across the carpet. An antique hall table that had belonged to Patricia's grandmother lay in pieces, its delicate legs snapped like kindling. The carpet runner showed muddy paw prints and dark stains that made Emily's stomach clench with dread. At 8:15 a.m., Gallatin County Coroner Dr. Michael Thompson arrived at the scene, accompanied by his assistant, Rebecca Foster. Dr. Thompson, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and a gentle demeanor that belied his grim profession, had served as county coroner for over 15 years. He had investigated deaths from everything from automobile accidents to climbing falls, but the preliminary description of this scene had left him unsettled during the drive from Bozeman. "Deputies, Dr. Richardson," he greeted the team assembled in the destroyed living room. "I understand we have a potential animal attack with 2 missing persons." "That's correct, Doctor." "Thompson," Maria replied. "Harold and Patricia Lewis, both in their 70s. We haven't located them yet, but there's clear evidence of bear presence throughout the house, along with significant amounts of blood evidence." Rebecca Foster, Dr. Thompson's assistant and a former nurse with extensive experience in trauma medicine, began setting up the portable equipment they would need to properly document any human remains they might discover. At 28, Rebecca had initially been drawn to forensic science by television crime dramas, but the reality of the work had proven far more challenging and emotionally demanding than anything depicted on screen. The search of the bedrooms revealed additional destruction, but no sign of the Lewis couple. The master bedroom showed evidence that the bear had spent considerable time there, with the king-sized bed overturned and the mattress dragged partially into the hallway. Patricia's jewelry box had been knocked from the dresser, its contents scattered across the floor in a glittering trail of broken necklaces and scattered earrings. In Harold's office, his computer desk had been completely destroyed. The heavy wooden structure reduced to splinters and twisted metal. His prized collection of agricultural equipment manuals and ranching journals had been shredded, their pages creating a paper blizzard throughout the small room. The window in this room had also been broken, apparently from the inside, and there were more blood smears on the frame. "Dr. Richardson," Frank called from the hallway, "you need to see this." Emily joined the deputy at the entrance to what had been Patricia's sewing room. The small space, typically organized with military precision, showed signs of the most violent struggle yet discovered. The sewing machine, a heavy Singer model that Patricia had inherited from her mother, had been hurled against the far wall with such force that it had punched a hole through the drywall. Spools of thread and pieces of fabric were scattered everywhere, creating a colorful chaos that contrasted sharply with the violence it represented. But it was what Frank had discovered behind the overturned cutting table that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. A section of the hardwood flooring had been torn up, the boards splintered and scattered to reveal the subfloor beneath. In the exposed area, deep gouges in the wood were clearly visible, along with dark stains that could only be blood. "This is where we'll find them, Doctor," Thompson said quietly, his professional demeanor unable to completely mask the emotion in his voice. The bear was digging. They're under the house. The Lewis home had been built with a full basement, accessible through a separate entrance on the north side of the house. Harold had used the space primarily for storage and his woodworking shop, where he crafted the beautiful birdhouses and garden benches that Patricia placed throughout their property. The basement entrance, a heavy steel door set into a concrete foundation, showed clear evidence of the bear's attention. The door itself had been bent and twisted off its hinges, the thick steel warped like aluminum foil. Deep claw marks scored the concrete walls around the entrance, and the metal frame had been completely destroyed. It was clear that the bear had eventually given up on this approach and found another way to access the space beneath the house. "The bear tried multiple entry points," Emily observed as she documented the damage. "This level of persistence and problem-solving ability is extremely unusual. Most bears would have left the area after encountering this much human scent and structural obstacles." Deputy Clark coordinated with dispatch to request additional resources, including a K-9 unit and personnel from the State Crime Lab. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond a simple wildlife encounter into something that would require the full resources of multiple agencies. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks would need to launch a hunt for the responsible bear, while the Sheriff's Department would need to conduct a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding the deaths. At 9:30 a.m., James Mitchell was interviewed in detail about his discovery of the scene. The hay contractor sat in the front seat of Maria's patrol car, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Rebecca Foster had brought from a thermos in the coroner's vehicle. Despite the morning warmth, James couldn't seem to stop shivering as he recounted his arrival at the ranch. "I come up here every other Tuesday morning, regular as clockwork," James explained, his voice still carrying a tremor. "Harold and Patricia, they always had their check ready, and Patricia would usually offer me a cup of coffee and maybe a slice of whatever she'd been baking. She made the best huckleberry pie in the county, you know." James had been delivering hay to ranches throughout the Gallatin Valley for over 20 years, building relationships with his customers that went far beyond simple business transactions. He knew which ranchers preferred early morning deliveries and which ones liked to chat about weather and cattle prices. The Lewis couple had been among his favorites, always friendly and welcoming, treating him more like family than a service provider. "When I pulled up this morning, I could tell something was wrong right away," James continued. "Usually Patricia's got her chickens out in the yard, and you can hear them carrying on from clear down the driveway. But this morning it was dead quiet. Then I saw the front of the house, and I just about turned around and left right then." The silence that James had noticed was indeed significant. Patricia's small flock of Rhode Island red chickens, which typically roamed freely around the yard during the day, were nowhere to be seen. Emily made a mental note to search for the birds, as their presence or absence could provide important information about the timeline of the bear's visit. "Did you notice anything unusual in the weeks leading up to today?" Maria asked. "Any signs of bear activity in the area? Damaged garbage cans, torn up gardens, anything like that?" James thought carefully before responding. "Well, now that you mention it, Harold did say something last week about finding some torn-up ground near his cattle pond. Said it looked like something big had been digging around up there. But you know how it is this time of year. Could have been anything. Elk, maybe, or just the ground settling from the spring runoff." The cattle pond that James referenced was located approximately half a mile north of the house, in a natural depression that collected runoff from the surrounding hills. Harold had improved the site several years earlier by installing a small earthen dam and planting native grasses around the perimeter to prevent erosion. The pond provided water for his cattle during the summer months and had become a popular gathering spot for local wildlife. Dr. Richardson made arrangements to visit the pond site later in the day as part of her investigation into the bear's behavior patterns. Understanding where the animal had been feeding and how long it had been in the area would be crucial for determining its likely movements and potential danger to other residents in the valley. The basement excavation began at 10:45 a.m. under the careful supervision of Dr. Thompson and his team. Using a combination of hand tools and small mechanical equipment borrowed from a local construction company, the investigators carefully began the process of accessing the space beneath the damaged flooring. The work was slow and methodical, as they needed to preserve any evidence while also maintaining the structural integrity of the house. Rebecca Foster documented each stage of the excavation with photographs and detailed notes, creating a permanent record of the recovery process. The basement itself was partially finished, with concrete floors and walls that Harold had painted white to maximize the available light from small windows set near the ceiling. His woodworking bench dominated one corner of the space, its surface covered with the tools and projects that he would never complete. The discovery of Harold and Patricia Lewis came at 11:20 a.m. Their bodies were found in the northwest corner of the basement, beneath what had been the sewing room floor. The scene was devastating, even for experienced professionals who had dealt with traumatic deaths throughout their careers. Dr. Thompson immediately established a perimeter around the remains and began the careful process of documentation and recovery. Harold Benjamin Lewis had apparently made a valiant attempt to protect his wife of 33 years. His body was positioned between Patricia and the damaged floor above, his arms wrapped around her in a final gesture of love and protection. The 76-year-old man had suffered massive trauma, but even in death, his primary concern had clearly been for the woman he had cherished for over 3 decades. Patricia Ann Lewis was found clutched in her husband's arms, her small frame dwarfed by Harold's protective embrace. At 74, she had been in excellent health for her age, maintaining an active lifestyle that included daily walks around the ranch and regular gardening work. Her grey hair, which she had worn in the same simple style for years, was matted with blood and debris from the destruction above. Dr. Thompson worked with quiet efficiency to document the scene and prepare the remains for transport to the state crime lab in Missoula, where complete autopsies would be performed. The preliminary examination suggested that both victims had died from massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack, but the formal determination of cause and manner of death would require extensive forensic analysis. The emotional impact of the discovery hit the investigation team hard. Maria Santos, despite her years of law enforcement experience, found herself struggling to maintain her professional composure as she watched the bodies being carefully removed from the basement. Frank Clark, a grandfather himself, stepped outside for several minutes to compose himself before returning to his duties. Emily Richardson felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with every bear attack investigation. As the state's lead expert on grizzly bear behavior, she would need to determine whether the attacking animal posed an ongoing threat to public safety and coordinate efforts to locate and potentially remove the bear from the area. The decision to kill a grizzly bear was never taken lightly, given the species' protected status and the importance of each individual to the overall population recovery. News of the Lewis deaths spread quickly through the Bozeman community, carried by the efficient network of social media, text messages, and phone calls that connected neighbors and friends throughout the valley. By noon, several local news outlets had arrived at the ranch, their satellite trucks and camera crews setting up along the public road that bordered the Lewis property. Sarah Mitchell, a reporter for KBZK-TV and no relation to Hay contractor James Mitchell, had covered numerous stories in the Gallatin Valley during her 5 years with the station. However, the Lewis bear attack represented one of the most significant news events she had ever covered. As she prepared for her live broadcast from the scene, Sarah struggled to find the words to convey the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the beloved elderly couple. This is Sarah Mitchell reporting from Bridger Canyon Road, where the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department is investigating what appears to be a fatal bear attack on two elderly residents. She began her noon broadcast. Harold and Patricia Lewis, both well-known members of the Bozeman community, were found deceased this morning in their ranch home after what investigators describe as an unprecedented attack by a grizzly bear. The story would eventually be picked up by national news outlets, bringing unwanted attention to the small mountain community and reigniting debates about wildlife management policies throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. For the residents of the Gallatin Valley, however, the focus remained on mourning the loss of two people who had been integral parts of their community for over 3 decades. Pastor William Henderson of the First Presbyterian Church received the news of the Lewis deaths while preparing his sermon for the upcoming Sunday service. At 62, Pastor Henderson had served the congregation for 18 years, officiating at countless weddings, baptisms, and funerals during his tenure. However, the violent nature of Harold and Patricia's deaths presented unique challenges for a man whose faith had been built on the belief in a loving and protective God. Patricia Lewis had been one of the church's most dedicated volunteers, organizing the annual holiday bazaar and coordinating meal deliveries for sick or elderly congregation members. Harold, while less involved in the day-to-day activities of the church, had been a generous supporter and had personally crafted several pieces of furniture for the church fellowship hall. Their sudden and violent deaths would leave a void in the congregation that would take years to fill. The investigation into the bear's movements and behavior patterns began in earnest during the afternoon hours. Emily Richardson, working with a team of wildlife technicians from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, began the process of tracking the animal's approach to the Lewis Ranch and attempting to determine where it might have gone after the attack. The tracking team included veteran wildlife technician Robert Bear Johnson, whose 30 years of experience with large carnivores throughout the Northern Rockies had earned him a reputation as one of the best trackers in the region. At 55, Bear Johnson had participated in dozens of bear capture and relocation operations, and he had developed an almost intuitive understanding of grizzly behavior patterns. "This bear came down from the high country," Bear observed as he examined tracks along the game trail behind the Lewis house. "See how the pads are worn smooth on the front feet? That's from walking on rocks and hard ground up in the alpine areas. This animal has been traveling for some distance to get here." The tracks told a story of a large male grizzly that had descended from the Bridger Mountains, following established wildlife corridors that connected the high-elevation habitat with the valley floor. The bear had likely been attracted to the area by the scent of the Lewis cattle, as well as the various fruit trees and gardens that made the ranch an attractive feeding site. "The concerning thing is the lack of fear behavior," Emily noted as she photographed a particularly clear track. "A normal grizzly would have detected human scent long before approaching this close to the house. The fact that this animal persisted in attempting to gain entry suggests either a bear that has become habituated to humans or possibly an animal that is ill or injured." The habituation theory was particularly troubling, as it suggested the bear might have had previous positive experiences with human food sources that had overcome its natural wariness. Habituated bears posed a significant public safety threat, as they actively sought out human settlements and often became increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of food rewards. The search for Patricia's missing chickens provided additional clues about the bear's behavior and timeline. The bodies of 3 Rhode Island red hens were discovered approximately 200 yards from the house, near the edge of Harold's pasture. The birds showed clear signs of having been killed by a large predator, but they had not been consumed, suggesting that the bear had been focused on reaching the house rather than feeding. "This is very unusual behavior," Emily explained to the assembled investigation team. "A hungry bear would typically consume available prey immediately. The fact that these chickens were killed but not eaten suggests the bear was motivated by something other than simple foraging." The afternoon brought additional personnel to the scene, including Agent David Torres from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As the federal agency responsible for enforcing the Endangered Species Act, the Fish and Wildlife Service had jurisdiction over any actions taken regarding the grizzly bear responsible for the attack. Agent Torres, a 38-year-old former Marine with extensive experience in wildlife law enforcement, would coordinate with state and local agencies to ensure that all actions taken were legally appropriate and scientifically sound. "Our primary concern is public safety," Agent Torres explained during a briefing with the investigation team. "However, we also have a responsibility to ensure that any management actions taken are necessary and appropriate. We'll need to gather as much evidence as possible about this specific bear's behavior before making any decisions about removal." The legal framework surrounding grizzly bear management was complex and often controversial. While the species remained protected under the Endangered Species Act, federal regulations allowed for the removal of individual bears that posed a demonstrated threat to human safety. However, each case required extensive documentation and approval from multiple agencies before any action could be taken. Dr. Thompson completed his preliminary examination of the Lewis remains and prepared them for transport to the State Crime Lab in Missoula. The formal autopsy process would take several days, but his initial findings confirmed that both victims had died from massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack. The specific details of their injuries would be crucial for understanding the bear's behavior and determining the appropriate management response. "Based on what I've observed at the scene, Doctor," Thompson told the assembled team, both victims suffered extensive trauma that would have resulted in rapid death. While this doesn't diminish the tragedy of their loss, it does suggest that their suffering was likely brief. The coroner's words provided little comfort to the growing number of community members who had gathered along the public road near the ranch. News of the Lewis deaths had spread throughout the valley, bringing friends, neighbors, and curious onlookers to the scene. Several people had brought flowers and handwritten notes, creating an impromptu memorial that would continue to grow in the coming days. Among the mourners was Eleanor Carson, Patricia's closest friend and fellow church member. The 78-year-old retired librarian had known Patricia for over 20 years, bonding over their shared love of gardening and literature. Eleanor stood quietly beside her car, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she tried to process the violent end to her friend's life. "Patricia was the kindest person I've ever known," Eleanor told Sarah Mitchell during a brief interview. "She opened her home to everyone, whether you were a neighbor who needed help with canning or a stranger who was passing through town. I just can't understand how something like this could happen to someone so good." The emotional toll of the investigation was evident on all the personnel involved. Maria Santos, despite her professional training and experience, found herself thinking about her own elderly parents and the vulnerability that came with aging in a landscape where humans were not always the dominant predator. Frank Clark struggled with the knowledge that Harold and Patricia had died alone and afraid, unable to summon help or escape from their attacker. As the afternoon progressed, Emily Richardson began developing a profile of the attacking bear based on the physical evidence collected at the scene. The size of the tracks suggested a large male grizzly weighing between 600 and 700 pounds, likely in the 15 to 20-year age range based on the wear patterns on the claws and pads. The animal appeared to be in good physical condition, as evidenced by the clear, deep impressions left in the soil and the extensive property damage it had been able to inflict. "This is not a starving or desperate bear," Emily explained to Agent Torres. "The tracks show good muscle mass and body condition. The animal was strong enough to tear through substantial structural elements of the house, including steel doors and heavy timber framing. We're dealing with a mature, physically capable predator that, for whatever reason, has lost its natural fear of humans." The behavioral analysis was equally concerning. The bear had spent considerable time investigating the Lewis property, circling the house multiple times before attempting to gain entry. Once inside, the animal had systematically explored every room, suggesting a level of curiosity and persistence that was highly unusual for the species. Most bear intrusions into human dwellings were brief affairs focused on obtaining food, but this animal had remained in the house for an extended period of time, despite the obvious human presence. Evening brought new challenges as the investigation team prepared to expand their search for the attacking bear. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had mobilized additional personnel, including helicopter pilots who would conduct aerial surveys of the surrounding mountains beginning at first light. The goal was to locate the bear and determine its current movements before it could potentially encounter other humans in the area. The decision to actively hunt the bear was not taken lightly. Dr. Richardson consulted with bear management specialists throughout the region, seeking input on the most appropriate response to the unprecedented attack. The consensus was clear. An animal that had demonstrated this level of aggression toward humans represented an unacceptable public safety risk and would need to be removed from the population. Local ranchers and residents received emergency notifications advising them to take additional precautions to secure their properties and avoid outdoor activities during dawn and dusk hours when bears were most active. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Department increased patrols throughout the canyon area, and several neighboring ranches reported increased security measures, including motion-activated lights and alarm systems. The Lewis family members began arriving in Bozeman during the evening hours, traveling from across the country to deal with the tragedy that had befallen their elderly relatives. Harold's son, Michael Lewis, flew in from Denver, while Patricia's daughter, Jennifer Walsh, drove through the night from Seattle. Both faced the difficult task of making funeral arrangements while also dealing with the media attention and investigation that surrounded their parents' deaths. Michael Lewis, a 48-year-old insurance executive, had spoken with his father just 3 days earlier during their regular weekly phone call. Harold had mentioned seeing more wildlife around the ranch lately, including what he thought might have been bear sign near the cattle pond, but he had not seemed particularly concerned about any potential threats. Dad was always aware of the wildlife around the ranch, Michael told investigators during a preliminary interview. He and Patricia took reasonable precautions. They kept a clean camp, secured their garbage, and generally respected the fact that they were living in bear country. I never imagined that something like this could happen to them. Jennifer Walsh, a 51-year-old teacher and mother of 3, struggled to reconcile the violent nature of her mother's death with the peaceful life that Patricia had built on the ranch. The daughter had visited just 1 month earlier, helping her mother with spring gardening and enjoying the quiet beauty of the mountain setting that her parents had loved so deeply. Mom and Dad chose to live here because they loved the wildlife and the connection to nature, Jennifer said through her tears. The irony that the thing they loved most is what ultimately took their lives is almost too much to bear. The first night after the attack brought additional security concerns as investigators worried about the potential for the bear to return to the area. Wildlife experts knew that bears often revisited successful feeding sites, and the extensive destruction at the Lewis house might have created positive associations for the attacking animal. A 24-hour security presence was established at the ranch with armed personnel from multiple agencies taking shifts to monitor the property. Dr. Richardson spent the night reviewing scientific literature on grizzly bear attack patterns, searching for similar cases that might provide insight into the animal's behavior and likely movements. The level of property destruction and the persistence of the attack were virtually unprecedented in the documented literature, suggesting that this particular animal represented a unique and extremely dangerous individual. The State Crime Lab in Missoula began processing physical evidence from the scene, including hair samples, saliva traces, and other biological material that might provide additional information about the attacking bear. DNA analysis would potentially allow investigators to determine if the animal had been involved in any previous incidents throughout the region, creating a more complete picture of its behavioral history. Bear management officials throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem were notified of the attack and asked to review their files for any reports of unusual bear behavior or aggressive encounters. The regional network of wildlife professionals began coordinating their efforts to track the animal's movements and prevent additional human casualties. The second day of the investigation began before dawn, with the launch of helicopter surveys designed to locate the attacking bear and track its movements through the mountainous terrain surrounding the Lewis Ranch. The aerial team included experienced pilots from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, along with wildlife biologists equipped with radio telemetry equipment and tranquilizer guns. Chief Pilot Janet Morrison had been flying wildlife surveys throughout Montana for over 15 years, and she had participated in dozens of bear capture operations during her career. At 42, Janet understood the challenges of locating a single animal in the vast wilderness of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But she also knew that public safety demanded an aggressive response to this particular situation. "We're looking for a large male grizzly that's likely moved back into heavy timber after the attack," Janet explained during the pre-flight briefing. "These animals typically travel along ridgelines and established game trails, so we'll focus our search on the likely escape routes leading north into the Bridger Mountains." The helicopter surveys covered over 200 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, including dense forests, alpine meadows, and rocky cliff faces that provided ideal habitat for grizzly bears. The search team documented several black bears and numerous other wildlife species, but found no sign of the large grizzly that had attacked the Lewis couple. Meanwhile, ground teams continued their investigation of the crime scene, documenting additional evidence and attempting to reconstruct the timeline of the attack. The pattern of destruction suggested that the bear had first approached the house during the early morning hours, possibly around 5 a.m., when Harold and Patricia would have been sleeping. "The initial attack likely occurred in the master bedroom," Emily explained to the assembled team. "The bear gained entry through the living room, but the heaviest concentration of blood evidence is found in the bedroom area." The victims then attempted to escape to the basement, where they were ultimately cornered and killed. The reconstruction painted a horrifying picture of the elderly couple's final hours. Harold and Patricia had likely been awakened by the sound of the bear destroying their living room, giving them enough time to attempt an escape to the basement through the interior stairway. However, the bear had pursued them into the lower level of the house, where the confined space had made escape impossible. Physical evidence suggested that Harold had made a valiant attempt to defend his wife, using a piece of broken furniture as a weapon against the massive predator. The elderly rancher's final act had been to shield Patricia with his own body, providing her with what little protection he could offer against an animal that weighed more than both of them combined. The autopsy results, released on the third day after the attack, confirmed the preliminary findings and provided additional details about the nature of the assault. Both Harold and Patricia Lewis had died from massive trauma inflicted by a large predator, with bite marks and claw wounds consistent with an adult grizzly bear. The force of the attack had been so severe that both victims had suffered extensive internal injuries that would have caused rapid death. Dr. Sarah Collins, the chief medical examiner for the state of Montana, had performed thousands of autopsies during her 20-year career, but the Lewis case represented one of the most severe predator attacks she had ever documented. The level of trauma was consistent with documented grizzly bear attacks from Alaska and Western Canada, but was virtually unprecedented in the lower 48 states. The injuries sustained by both victims are consistent with an extremely aggressive attack by a large grizzly bear, Dr. Collins reported to the investigation team. The pattern of wounds suggests that the animal continued its assault well beyond what would have been necessary to incapacitate the victims, indicating a level of aggression that is highly unusual for the species. The medical examiner's findings reinforced the decision to actively hunt the attacking bear, as the level of aggression demonstrated posed an unacceptable risk to other residents in the area. Wildlife officials expanded their search efforts, bringing in additional personnel and equipment from throughout the region. The fourth day brought frustrating news, as search teams reported no success in locating the attacking bear, despite extensive air and ground operations. The animal appeared to have vanished into the vast wilderness of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where thousands of square miles of rugged terrain provided countless hiding places for a creature that had evolved to remain concealed from human detection. "We're dealing with an animal that knows this terrain better than we do," admitted Bear Johnson during the daily briefing. "Grizzlies can travel 20 or 30 miles in a day when they want to, and this particular bear has demonstrated that it's not following normal behavioral patterns. It could be anywhere from here to Yellowstone Park by now." The expanding search area created logistical challenges for the multiple agencies involved in the hunt. Coordination between Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and local law enforcement required constant communication and careful planning to avoid conflicts and ensure public safety. Community meetings were organized throughout the Gallatin Valley to inform residents about the ongoing search and provide guidance on personal safety measures. The meetings, held at local schools and community centers, drew hundreds of concerned citizens who sought information about protecting themselves and their families from potential bear encounters. Dr. Richardson addressed the largest of these meetings, held at Bozeman High School on the fifth evening after the attack. The auditorium was packed with ranchers, homeowners, and outdoor enthusiasts who lived and worked in areas that might be visited by the attacking bear. "I want to emphasize that this was an extremely unusual event," Emily told the assembled crowd. "Grizzly bears typically avoid human contact, and fatal attacks are extremely rare. However, the behavior demonstrated by this particular animal requires us to take extraordinary precautions until it can be located and removed." The meeting included presentations on bear safety, proper food storage, and emergency procedures for anyone who might encounter the attacking animal. Local hardware stores reported runs on bear spray, motion-activated lights, and other security equipment as residents took steps to protect their properties. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate area of the Lewis Ranch. Throughout the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, residents who had previously felt comfortable sharing their landscape with large predators began to question whether coexistence was truly possible. The violent nature of the Lewis deaths challenged long-held assumptions about bear behavior and the effectiveness of traditional safety measures. Dr. Amanda Foster, a wildlife psychologist with the University of Montana, was called in to assist with community counseling and education efforts. Her research focused on human responses to wildlife encounters, and she understood the complex emotional reactions that predator attacks triggered in affected communities. "It's natural for people to feel fear and anxiety after an event like this, Doctor," Foster explained to local officials. "The key is channeling those emotions into appropriate precautionary behaviors rather than allowing them to escalate into panic or calls for wholesale elimination of the bear population." The balance between public safety and wildlife conservation became a central theme in media coverage of the Lewis attack. Environmental groups argued that the incident, while tragic, should not be used to justify broader changes to grizzly bear management policies. Hunting organizations and some local residents, however, called for more aggressive population control measures and expanded hunting opportunities. The debate was complicated by the protected status of grizzly bears under the Endangered Species Act, which limited management options and required extensive documentation before any population-level actions could be taken. Federal wildlife officials found themselves walking a careful line between acknowledging legitimate public safety concerns and maintaining their commitment to species conservation. On the 6th day after the attack, the search effort received a potential breakthrough when a trail camera operated by a local outfitter captured images of a large male grizzly bear approximately 15 miles northeast of the Lewis Ranch. The photographs, taken during the early morning hours, showed an animal that appeared to match the size and description of the attacking bear. The trail camera was located along a well-used game trail that connected the Bridger Mountains with the Absaroka Range to the east. Wildlife officials immediately dispatched ground teams to the area, hoping to pick up fresh tracks or other sign that might lead them to the animal's current location. "These photographs are encouraging because they show the bear is still in the general area," explained Agent Torres. "However, we need to be cautious about assuming this is definitely our animal. There are several large male grizzlies in this population, and visual identification from trail camera photos can be challenging." The ground team that responded to the trail camera location included some of the most experienced bear trackers in the region. In addition to Bear Johnson from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the team included tribal wildlife specialists from the Crow Nation and tracking experts from the U.S. Forest Service. The trackers found clear evidence that a large grizzly had passed through the area, including fresh scat samples and claw marks on trees that suggested territorial marking behavior. However, the tracks were several hours old, and the bear had apparently continued moving east toward more remote areas of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. "This animal is covering a lot of ground," observed Tom Hawk Feathers, a wildlife biologist with the Crow Nation who had joined the tracking effort. "The spacing between the tracks and the direction of travel suggest a bear that's moving with purpose, not just wandering randomly through the landscape." The eastward movement of the bear created new challenges for search teams as the animal was heading into some of the most remote and inaccessible terrain in the region. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness included vast areas where helicopter access was limited and ground travel was extremely difficult even for experienced wilderness professionals. Weather conditions complicated the search effort as a late-season snowstorm moved through the high country, dropping several inches of new snow above 8,000 feet in elevation. While the fresh snow would make tracking easier once the storm passed, it also created dangerous flying conditions that grounded the helicopter search teams for 2 full days. The delay caused by weather allowed the bear to potentially expand its range even further, reducing the likelihood of a successful capture operation. Wildlife officials began considering alternative strategies, including the use of trained tracking dogs and expanded camera trap networks to monitor the animal's movements. On the 8th day after the attack, The investigation took an unexpected turn when DNA analysis of hair samples collected at the Lewis Ranch revealed that the attacking bear had been previously documented by wildlife researchers. The genetic profile matched samples collected 3 years earlier during a routine population survey in Yellowstone National Park, approximately 60 miles south of the attack site. This information gives us a much better understanding of this animal's history and behavior patterns, explained Dr. Richardson. The bear was captured and fitted with a radio collar in 2022, but the collar apparently failed or was removed somehow because we haven't received any tracking signals from it in over a year. The historical data on the bear revealed a troubling pattern of increasingly bold behavior around human developments. Park records showed multiple incidents where the animal had approached campgrounds and visitor facilities, leading to several temporary area closures and management actions designed to discourage the bear's presence. This bear has been on our radar for some time, admitted Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief wildlife biologist for Yellowstone National Park, and coincidentally sharing a name with Patricia Lewis's daughter. We've documented several instances where this animal showed less fear of humans than we would typically expect, but nothing that rose to the level of requiring removal from the population. The revelation that the attacking bear had a documented history of problematic behavior raised difficult questions about wildlife management decisions and the criteria used to determine when individual animals posed unacceptable risks to human safety. Critics argued that earlier intervention might have prevented the Lewis tragedy, while wildlife officials defended their previous decisions as appropriate based on the information available at the time. The expanded search effort now focused on areas where the bear had been previously documented, including remote valleys and mountain passes that the animal had utilized during its movements between Yellowstone and the northern ranges. This historical knowledge allowed search teams to predict likely travel routes and position personnel and equipment more effectively. Funeral services for Harold and Patricia Lewis were held on the 10th day after the attack, drawing hundreds of mourners from throughout the Gallatin Valley and beyond. The service, conducted at the First Presbyterian Church, where Patricia had been such a dedicated volunteer, celebrated the lives of 2 people who had given generously to their community and had died protecting each other. Pastor Henderson delivered a eulogy that attempted to find meaning in the senseless tragedy while acknowledging the anger and fear that many community members felt in the aftermath of the attack. The service included musical tributes from the church choir that Patricia had supported for many years and readings from Harold's favorite passages of Scripture that reflected his love for the natural world. Harold and Patricia lived their lives with grace, kindness, and an abiding love for the beautiful landscape that surrounded their home, Pastor Henderson told the packed church. While we struggle to understand the circumstances of their deaths, we can honor their memory by continuing to live with the same generosity of spirit that they demonstrated every day. The funeral procession to Sunset Hills Cemetery included vehicles from throughout the valley, creating a miles-long convoy that served as a testament to the impact that the Lewis couple had made on their community. The burial service was brief and private, attended only by immediate family members and closest friends. Following the funeral, the search for the attacking bear continued with renewed urgency as wildlife officials worried about the potential for additional encounters as summer outdoor recreation activities increased throughout the region. The Memorial Day weekend was approaching, bringing thousands of visitors to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for camping, hiking, and fishing activities. The timing created a complex public relations challenge for park and forest officials who needed to balance honest disclosure of the ongoing threat with their responsibility to support the local tourism economy. Additional warning signs were posted at trailheads and campgrounds throughout the region, and backcountry permits began including specific advisories about the Lewis bear attack. On the 12th day after the attack, search teams received their most promising lead, yet when a group of backcountry hikers reported an aggressive encounter with a large grizzly bear in a remote valley approximately 25 miles east of the Lewis Ranch. The hikers, experienced outdoors enthusiasts from Billings, described an animal that approached their campsite repeatedly, despite their efforts to discourage it with noise and bear spray. "This bear showed absolutely no fear of humans," reported lead hiker Michael Santos, a 34-year-old engineer who had been backpacking in bear country for over 15 years. "It walked right into our camp in broad daylight and began investigating our food storage, even though we had followed all the proper protocols for bear-proofing our site." The hiking group had managed to retreat to a safe distance and had used satellite communication equipment to report the encounter to authorities. Their description of the bear's size and behavior matched the profile of the Lewis attacker, and the location was consistent with the animal's projected movement patterns. Emergency response teams were immediately dispatched to the area, including helicopter crews equipped with tranquilizer equipment and experienced wildlife capture specialists. The remote location of the encounter required careful coordination to ensure that personnel could reach the site safely while maximizing the chances of locating the bear. The helicopter team, led by Chief Pilot Janet Morrison, reached the reported encounter site within 2 hours of receiving the alert. Initial aerial surveys revealed fresh bear sign throughout the valley, including torn-up vegetation and daybeds that suggested the animal had been in the area for several days. "We've got clear evidence of a large grizzly using this valley extensively," Janet reported via radio to the command center. "The vegetation patterns and ground disturbance are consistent with an animal that's been feeding and resting here for an extended period." Ground teams rappelled from the helicopter to begin detailed tracking operations, while the aircraft continued aerial surveillance of the surrounding area. The trackers immediately confirmed that a large male grizzly had been present in the valley, with tracks and scat samples providing additional evidence to support the hikers' account. The tracking operation was led by Bear Johnson, whose 3 decades of experience had prepared him for exactly this type of challenging pursuit. Working with a team of specialists from multiple agencies, Bear began the careful process of following the animal's trail through the dense timber and rocky terrain of the remote valley. "This bear is moving with purpose and showing very little concern about leaving obvious sign," Bear observed as he examined a series of claw marks on a large fir tree. "Most grizzlies try to stay concealed when they're in areas where they might encounter humans, but this animal seems to be marking territory and establishing dominance." The trail led through a series of meadows and timber stands that provided ideal grizzly habitat, with abundant food sources including roots, berries, and small mammals. The bear had clearly been feeding extensively during its time in the valley, which was consistent with normal behavior for the species during the early summer months. However, the animal's response to the hikers' presence was distinctly abnormal. Rather than avoiding the human campsite, the bear had repeatedly approached despite clear signals that the area was occupied. This behavior suggested either a bear that had become habituated to human food sources or an animal that was actively seeking confrontation with humans. As the tracking team followed the trail deeper into the valley, they discovered additional evidence of the bear's aggressive behavior. A destroyed campsite, apparently abandoned by previous visitors, showed signs of extensive damage, including shredded tents, scattered equipment, and clear evidence that the bear had systematically investigated every aspect of the human presence. "This is exactly the type of behavior we saw at the Lewis Ranch," noted Dr. Richardson, who had joined the ground team. The bear is not just foraging for food, it's actively seeking out human settlements and investigating them thoroughly. This suggests a level of curiosity and boldness that poses a significant public safety risk. The discovery of the destroyed campsite raised concerns about additional victims who might not have reported their encounters with the aggressive bear. Search teams began expanding their efforts to locate any other individuals who might have encountered the animal during its movements through the remote backcountry areas. Radio communications were established with all backcountry ranger stations throughout the region, and emergency alerts were sent to registered backpackers and campers who might be in areas where the bear could potentially travel. The coordination effort involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions, requiring constant communication to ensure that all personnel were aware of the animal's likely location and movements. On the 14th day after the Lewis attack, the intensive search operation finally achieved success when helicopter crews spotted the large male grizzly in a high alpine meadow approximately 30 miles from the original crime scene. The bear was feeding on glacier lily bulbs in an area above timberline, where its massive size made it clearly visible from the air. We have visual contact with a large male grizzly that matches the description of our target animal, Chief Pilot Janet Morrison reported to the command center. The bear is in open terrain and appears to be focused on feeding, which should give us a good opportunity for capture operations. The capture team included Dr. Richardson and wildlife veterinarian Dr. Marcus Webb, who would be responsible for the safe tranquilization and handling of the bear if capture was attempted. Dr. Webb, a 39-year-old specialist in large carnivore medicine, had participated in dozens of bear capture operations throughout his career, but he understood that this particular animal presented unique challenges. Given this bear's documented aggression toward humans, we need to approach the capture operation with extreme caution, Dr. Webb explained during the pre-operation briefing. Our primary concern is ensuring the safety of all personnel while achieving the management objective of removing this animal from the population. The decision to attempt capture rather than immediate lethal removal was controversial, with some officials arguing that the bear's documented aggression warranted immediate destruction. However, scientific protocols required that every effort be made to capture the animal alive for behavioral studies that might prevent similar incidents in the future. The tranquilization operation required careful calculation of drug dosages based on the bear's estimated weight and body condition. Dr. Webb prepared multiple syringes with different concentrations of immobilizing drugs, as the animal's size and aggressive nature meant that a single dose might not be sufficient to achieve safe handling conditions. The helicopter approached the feeding bear slowly, maintaining a distance that would allow for accurate dart placement while minimizing the risk of the animal's escape into dense timber. The bear initially showed little concern about the aircraft's presence, continuing to dig for lily bulbs while occasionally glancing up at the hovering helicopter. Target is approximately 650 pounds. Excellent body condition, showing minimal stress response to aircraft presence, Dr. Webb reported as he prepared for the shot. This animal's lack of fear toward humans is clearly demonstrated by its failure to retreat despite our proximity. The first tranquilizer dart struck the bear in the shoulder muscle, delivering a precisely calculated dose of immobilizing drugs. The bear reacted to the dart's impact by spinning around and attempting to remove the foreign object with its teeth, but the quick-acting medication began taking effect within minutes. Rather than seeking cover or attempting to escape, the bear showed clear signs of aggression even as the tranquilizer began affecting its coordination. The animal reared up on its hind legs and vocalized loudly, displaying the intimidation behaviors that had likely been used during the attack on the Lewis couple. This bear is showing extremely atypical behavior even under chemical restraint, observed Dr. Richardson, most grizzlies become docile and seek hiding places as tranquilizers take effect. But this animal is maintaining aggressive posturing despite obvious impairment. The unusual behavior continued as the bear gradually succumbed to the tranquilizer, with the animal making several aggressive charges toward imaginary threats, even as its coordination deteriorated. The display reinforced the decision to remove the bear from the population, as it clearly demonstrated the animal's inappropriate response to perceived challenges. Within 15 minutes of the dart's impact, the bear was sufficiently immobilized to allow the ground team to approach safely. Dr. Webb and his assistants carefully monitored the animal's vital signs while preparing equipment for the detailed examination that would follow. The physical examination of the tranquilized bear revealed an animal in excellent health with no obvious injuries or conditions that might explain its aggressive behavior toward humans. At an estimated age of 18 years and weighing 687 pounds, the bear represented a prime example of the species at the peak of its physical capabilities. "This is a magnificent animal in perfect health, Doctor," Webb reported as he completed his examination. "There are no injuries, no signs of disease, and no physical abnormalities that would account for its behavioral problems. From a purely biological standpoint, this bear represents the ideal success story of grizzly recovery in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Tissue samples were collected for additional testing, including blood work that would screen for diseases or toxins that might have affected the bear's neurological function. The samples would be analyzed by specialists at the National Wildlife Health Center in Wisconsin, with results expected within several weeks. The absence of obvious physical problems made the bear's aggressive behavior even more puzzling from a scientific standpoint. Dr. Richardson and other bear specialists had hoped to find clear evidence of injury or illness that might explain the animal's loss of natural fear and increased aggression toward humans. "We're dealing with a behavioral anomaly that we don't fully understand," Emily admitted during the post-capture briefing. "This bear appears to be physically perfect, which makes its willingness to attack humans even more concerning from a management perspective." The decision regarding the bear's fate was made jointly by officials from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Yellowstone National Park. Given the documented aggression toward humans and the specific nature of the Lewis attack, the consensus was unanimous that the animal could not be safely returned to the wild. Dr. Marcus Webb administered the lethal injection while the bear remained under anesthesia, ensuring that the animal experienced no distress during the process. The decision was emotionally difficult for all the wildlife professionals involved, as they recognized that they were ending the life of a magnificent predator that represented the successful recovery of a once-endangered species. "This is never an easy decision," Agent Torres explained to the assembled team. "However, our primary responsibility is public safety, and this particular animal had demonstrated that it posed an unacceptable risk to human life. The Lewis tragedy cannot be allowed to happen again." The bear's carcass was transported to the Montana State University Veterinary Laboratory for complete necropsy examination, including detailed analysis of brain tissue that might reveal neurological abnormalities not visible during the field examination. The scientific data gathered from the animal would contribute to ongoing research into grizzly bear behavior and management. News of the bear's capture and euthanization was met with mixed reactions from the public and conservation communities. Many residents of the Gallatin Valley expressed relief that the immediate threat had been eliminated, while others questioned whether lethal removal had been the appropriate response given the bear's protected status. Environmental groups issued statements expressing sadness over the bear's death while acknowledging the necessity of protecting human safety. The incident highlighted the ongoing challenges of managing recovering wildlife populations in landscapes increasingly dominated by human development and recreational activities. The Lewis family members issued a statement through their attorney expressing gratitude to all the agencies and personnel involved in locating and removing the threatening bear. While nothing could bring back Harold and Patricia, the family felt that justice had been served and that other families would be protected from similar tragedies. The final necropsy results, released 6 weeks after the bear's death, revealed no physical abnormalities that could account for its aggressive behavior toward humans. Brain tissue analysis showed no signs of disease, injury, or chemical contamination that might have affected the animal's neurological function. From a medical standpoint, this was a completely normal, healthy grizzly bear, reported Dr. Sarah Martinez, the veterinary pathologist who conducted the necropsy. The animal showed no signs of rabies, distemper, or any other condition that might explain its behavioral problems. This case will likely remain a mystery from a scientific perspective. The absence of clear medical explanations for the bear's behavior sparked renewed debate among wildlife professionals about the factors that might contribute to aggressive behavior in individual animals. Some experts suggested that genetic factors might play a role, while others pointed to possible environmental stressors or learned behaviors that could increase aggression. The Lewis Ranch was eventually sold to a developer who planned to subdivide the property for residential development. The beautiful log home where Harold and Patricia had lived for nearly 30 years was demolished due to the extensive structural damage caused by the bear attack, marking the end of an era for one of the valley's most distinctive properties. Patricia's gardens, which had brought her so much joy during her lifetime, were carefully preserved and transplanted to a memorial garden at the First Presbyterian Church. The community project, organized by her former garden club members, ensured that her horticultural legacy would continue to beautify the church grounds for generations to come. Harold's workshop tools and woodworking equipment were donated to the local high school's vocational program, where they would be used to teach future generations of students the craftsmanship skills that he had valued so highly. Several of his unfinished projects were completed by volunteer craftsmen and donated to charity auctions in the couple's memory. The investigation into the Lewis bear attack prompted significant changes in wildlife management protocols throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. New guidelines were developed for documenting and responding to reports of unusual bear behavior, with emphasis on earlier intervention when animals showed signs of losing their natural fear of humans. Enhanced monitoring systems were implemented throughout the region, including expanded networks of trail cameras and improved radio collar technology that would provide more reliable tracking data for individual bears. The goal was to identify potentially problematic animals before they could escalate to dangerous encounters with humans. Educational programs for residents and visitors were expanded to include more detailed information about recognizing and reporting unusual bear behavior. The Lewis case had demonstrated that traditional safety measures might not be sufficient when dealing with individual animals that had lost their natural wariness of humans. Dr. Emily Richardson continued her research into grizzly bear behavior, using the Lewis case as a foundation for studying the factors that might contribute to aggressive behavior in individual animals. Her work would eventually contribute to improved management protocols and better understanding of the complex relationship between humans and large predators. The tragic deaths of Harold and Patricia Lewis served as a stark reminder of the challenges involved in sharing the landscape with recovering populations of large carnivores. While the success of grizzly bear conservation was undeniable, the Lewis case highlighted the need for continued vigilance and adaptive management strategies to minimize the risk of future conflicts. Community memorials for the Lewis couple included annual scholarships for local students pursuing careers in agriculture or education, reflecting the couple's lifelong commitment to their community and its young people. The scholarships ensured that Harold and Patricia's legacy of generosity and community service would continue long after their tragic deaths. The bear attack also prompted legislative discussions about compensation for victims of wildlife encounters, as the Lewis family faced significant financial losses in addition to their emotional trauma. New state programs were eventually established to provide support for families affected by wildlife conflicts, recognizing the societal responsibility to assist those who bear the costs of conservation success. 1 year after the attack, a small memorial service was held at the site of the former Lewis Ranch, attended by family members, friends, and the law enforcement and wildlife professionals who had responded to the tragedy. The service provided closure for many who had been affected by the case and served as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in bear country. The Lewis bear attack remains one of the most extensively documented predator encounters in Montana history, providing valuable scientific data that continues to inform wildlife management decisions throughout the region. While the circumstances that led to the tragic deaths of Harold and Patricia Lewis may never be fully understood, their story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the complex challenges of coexistence with one of North America's most magnificent predators. The case file for the Lewis bear attack, maintained by the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, includes over 3,000 pages of reports, photographs, and scientific data that document every aspect of the investigation and response. This comprehensive record ensures that future wildlife professionals will have access to detailed information that may help prevent similar tragedies. Today, the meadow where Harold and Patricia Lewis once walked hand in hand through Patricia's gardens has returned to native grassland, and wildlife once again moves freely through the area where their dream home once stood. The circle of life continues in the Gallatin Valley, where humans and wildlife must find ways to coexist in an increasingly complex world. The story of Harold and Patricia Lewis serves as a reminder that even in our modern world, we remain vulnerable to the wild forces that shaped our ancestors' lives. Their deaths were a tragedy that touched an entire community, but their memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved them, and in the lessons learned from their final encounter with the wilderness they had chosen to call home.